The letter had been read so many times that the ink was fading. The paper had gone omped at the creases, thin as skin, fragile as the hope it carried. Clara Whitfield held it in her gloved hands as the train rocked westward, the rhythm of iron wheels on iron rails beating like a second heart beneath her feet. Outside the window, the world had changed. The gentle farmlands of the Midwest had surrendered to something vast and ancient. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks dressed in early snow, their shoulders wrapped in forests so dark they looked almost black. The sky above them was enormous, a blue so deep it ached. Clara lifted the letter and read it again, though she had memorized every word weeks ago. Her lips moved silently, forming the sentences the way a prayer is formed, not because the words are unknown, but because the act of saying them brings comfort. Dear Miss Whitfield, you asked me once what I see when I look out my window in the evening. I will tell you, I see the last light catching the tops of the pines, turning them to gold. I see the river below silver as a ribbon carrying the warmth of the day away. I see the first star, and I think of you, a woman I have never met who writes with such honesty that I feel I have known her all my life. I confess I am not a man of many words in person. The mountain makes a man quiet, but I want you to know that your letters have been the brightest thing in my world this year, and I wait for your arrival the way the valley waits for spring. Yours with respect and hope, E. Blackwood. Clara folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her chest. Her eyes stung. She whispered to herself so quietly that the words barely left her lips. He is kind. Whatever else he is kind. That is enough. That has to be enough. But her hands were trembling, and if she was honest with herself, truly honest, they had not stopped trembling since she boarded this train in Philadelphia 4 days ago. Clara Whitfield was 22 years old. She had never been west of Pittsburgh. She had never been alone with a man who was not a boarder in her aunt's house, and even those men she had only ever seen across a breakfast table or through the crack of a doorway. She had never been kissed. She had never been held. She had never stood in an open field under an open sky and felt the wind on her face without a building to block it. Everything she owned fit inside the carpet bag on her lap and the small trunk in the baggage car behind her. Everything she was leaving behind, she would not miss. Philadelphia, the boarding house on Chestnut Street, the cracked plaster walls, and the smell of boiled cabbage, and the sound of Aunt Prudence's voice cutting through every room like a blade that never dulled. No man will ever want a girl with no family, no dowry, and no grace, Prudence would say. She said it at breakfast. She said it while Clara scrubbed floors on her hands and knees. She said it to the boarders who would chuckle and shake their heads and glance at Clara with a particular pity reserved for animals too lame to be useful. You eat like a draft horse and look like one too. Clara was not beautiful by the standards of Philadelphia society. She knew this the way she knew the color of her own eyes, which were green and emerald green, that Prudence never mentioned because a compliment from Prudence would have cracked the foundation of the entire household. Clara was petite, barely 5'3", with a fuller figure that strained the seams of every dress she owned. Her hair was honey blonde, thick and wavy, her one vanity, the one part of herself she allowed herself to tend. Her face was heart-shaped, her skin pale from years spent indoors. She was in truth lovely, but no one had ever told her so, and she had never believed it. What Clara possessed in abundance was kindness. She was the girl who fed stray cats behind the boarding house. She was the girl who read aloud to Mr. Hadley, the elderly boarder, who had lost his sight spending hours with a borrowed book in her lap, and his grateful silence filling the room like warmth. She was the girl who mended a child's torn coat on the street without being asked, kneeling in the mud needle and thread appearing from her pocket as though she carried them for exactly this purpose. She did carry them for exactly this purpose. Clara Whitfield moved through the world, expecting to be needed and hoping to be noticed, and the first of these expectations was always fulfilled, while the second never was. She also possessed intelligence, though Prudence treated this as a character flaw. Clara had taught herself to read from discarded newspapers left behind by boarders. She wrote with a careful, elegant hand that surprised people who expected nothing elegant from her. She understood numbers. She understood accounts. She understood the quiet architecture of running a household because she had been running Prudence's for a decade without title or thanks. None of this mattered to Prudence. In Prudence's world, a woman's worth was measured by her face, her figure, and her prospects. Clara had failed on all three counts, and Prudence reminded her of this fact the way the sun reminds the earth of its presence, constantly, relentlessly, and without mercy. The advertisement in the Philadelphia Gazette had appeared on a Tuesday. Clara remembered the day because it was raining and because Prudence had just informed her with the casual cruelty that was her specialty that the boarding house was being sold. Prudence had found a suitor in Baltimore, a widowed tobacconist with money and bad teeth, and she was leaving. Clara was not invited. "You have 2 weeks," Prudence had said, not looking up from her tea. "Find somewhere to go or sleep in the street. It makes no difference to me." Clara had found the advertisement that evening, smoothing out a crumpled page of the Gazette that a boarder had used to wrap fish bones. The words seemed to glow on the page. "Respectable gentleman of means seeks bride of good character for companionship in partnership on Montana homestead. Inquire by letter." She had written that night, and the letters that came back had saved her life. Not dramatically, not the way a rope saves a drowning man. More quietly than that, more slowly. The letters saved her the way sunrise saves the night, not by fighting the darkness, but by replacing it gradually with something warm. The writer described himself as a rancher in Montana territory, a man of simple tastes who valued honesty and hard work above all. He wrote of mountain wildflowers and spring of elk herds crossing frozen rivers of the silence of snowfall. He never asked about her appearance. He asked about her favorite book. He asked about her happiest memory. He asked about her greatest fear. Clara fell in love with the letters before she ever considered falling in love with the man. She did not know that the letters were written by Caleb Blackwood, the middle of three brothers. She did not know that the respectable gentleman was in fact three men who shared a ranch, a name, and a desperate need. She did not know that the signature E. Blackwood referred to Elijah the eldest, whose name appeared on the legal arrangement, but whose hand had never touched the pen. She did not know anything at all. The woman across the aisle, a stout matron in a feathered hat, had been watching Clara for the past 100 miles. Now she leaned forward with a smile that contained curiosity disguised as concern. "Traveling alone, dear, a young girl like you?" Clara forced a smile. "I am meeting my husband." The woman's eyebrows climbed. "A mail order arrangement." Clara's silence was answer enough. The woman settled back with a knowing, pitying look. The same look Clara had received her entire life. The look that said, "Poor thing. She does not know what is coming." Clara turned back to the window. The mountains were closer now. Their shadows fell across the train like the shadows of gods. Somewhere up there, a man who wrote beautiful letters was waiting. And somewhere up there, two other men she did not expect were waiting too. 600 miles to the west, on a mountain so high that the clouds sometimes settled below the ranch like a white sea, three brothers were having a fight. The Blackwood Ranch sat at the top of a long, winding trail that climbed from the valley floor through dense ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, switchbacking across the face of a granite ridge before opening into a high meadow ringed by peaks. The house was large but rough-built of hand-hewn logs with a stone chimney, a covered porch, and a barn that was in better repair than the house itself. The brothers cared more about their horses and cattle than they cared about themselves. This had always been the case. This was perhaps the central problem. Inside the kitchen, the air smelled of coffee brewed too strong and tension stretched too thin. Elijah Blackwood stood at the stove with his back to his brothers, pouring coffee into a tin cup. He was the eldest at 34, and he looked it. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall with broad shoulders, a powerful chest, and arms thick with muscle from years of felling timber and wrestling cattle through mountain winters. His hair was dark chestnut brown, sun-streaked with lighter threads, worn slightly long, and perpetually tousled by wind. His eyes were amber, the color of whiskey held up to firelight, and they carried a permanent intensity. His jaw was square-shadowed with perpetual stubble, and a thin scar ran along his left cheekbone from a grisly encounter when he was 19. He had killed the bear. The bear had marked him first. Both facts were important. Elijah rarely smiled. He spoke in short, direct sentences. He made decisions for the family and expected them to be followed. This was not cruelty. This was the habit of a boy who had become a father to his brothers at 14 and had never been allowed to set that weight down. Their mother, Margaret, had died of fever when Elijah was 12. He had ridden through a snowstorm to fetch the doctor and gotten lost. By the time he returned, she was gone. He had never forgiven himself. Their father, Josiah, had walked into the mountains 2 years later and never come back. Elijah had never forgiven him either. Forgiveness was not a tool Elijah Blackwood kept in his kit. "She arrives on the noon stage," Elijah said flatly, not turning from the stove. "That is the end of it." Caleb Blackwood sat at the table, turning a wooden figure in his hands. A half-carved dough, delicate, emerging from a block of sugar pine. Caleb was 30 leaner than Elijah, with a rangy, graceful build and hair a warm honey brown that fell in soft waves to his collar. His eyes were the same amber as his brother's, but warmer with laugh lines at the corners that suggested a man who smiled more than his circumstances warranted. His face was the most classically handsome of the three. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, straight nose. But it was softened by a gentleness in his expression that neither of his brothers possessed. "She deserves to be welcomed, Eli," Caleb said carefully. "She is coming 2,000 miles. The least we can do is—" "The least we can do," came a voice from the doorway sharp as a struck match, "is tell her the truth, that this was a fool's errand from the start, and she should get back on that stage before the snow closes the pass." Jasper Blackwood leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his expression dark enough to bruise. He was the youngest at 26 and the tallest at 6'7", with a massive muscular frame that seemed built for violence rather than ranch work. His hair was dark auburn, almost copper in sunlight, cut shorter than his brother's roughly, with a knife. His eyes were amber like theirs, but harder, sharper, with a dangerous glitter that made strangers step backward. A faded scar crossed his knuckles from a barroom fight in Butte. Another traced his forearm from a rope burn that had nearly cost him his hand. Jasper was fire where Elijah was stone, and Caleb was water. He burned at everything. He burned at the ranch, at the isolation, at the town that feared them, at the memory of a mother he could barely recall, and a father who had vanished like smoke. He burned brightest at the idea of a mail-order bride. "Nobody asked me," Jasper said. Elijah turned. His amber eyes were flat. "We agreed." "You agreed. Caleb wrote his pretty letters and you signed your name to them like a contract on a horse sale. I said I did not care. That is not the same thing as agreement." "You said, and I quote, 'do whatever you want,'" Caleb replied quietly. "Those were your exact words." "Those were words of disgust, not consent." Elijah set his coffee cup down hard enough to slosh dark liquid onto the scarred wood of the table. "She is coming. She will be here by this afternoon. You can stand in that doorway and growl like a bear, or you can act like a man and make this work. Those are your choices, Jasper. Pick one." The three brothers stared at each other. Three men shaped by the same grief, the same mountains, the same silence. Pulled in three different directions by it. Elijah, who could not bend. Caleb, who bent too easily. Jasper, who would rather break. Jasper pushed off the door frame. "I will be in the barn." The door slammed. Caleb flinched. Elijah did not. "He will come around," Elijah said, though his voice carried no conviction. Caleb set down the half-carved dough and looked at his brother. "Eli, there is something I need to tell you about the letters." "What about the A pause. Caleb opened his mouth and closed it. He picked up the carving again, turning it slowly in his hands. "Nothing. Never mind. We should clean the house before she arrives." Elijah studied his brother for a long moment, then nodded once. He did not ask again. That was the Blackwood way. Questions unasked, truths unspoken, silence filling every room like snow, filling a valley cold and deep and covering everything that mattered. The stagecoach arrived in Ridgewater at noon, right on schedule. It pulled up in front of Pruitt's General Store with a lurch in a cloud of yellow dust that hung in the autumn air like something alive. The driver climbed down, spat tobacco juice into the dirt, and hauled Clara's trunk from the roof rack, dropping it in the street with a thud that made her wince. Clara stepped down from the stage and the world tilted. The air was thinner here. She felt it immediately, a lightness in her lungs that bordered on dizziness, as though the atmosphere itself was telling her she did not belong. The light was sharper too, almost painful in its clarity, every edge and surface outlined with a precision that Philadelphia's coal haze never allowed. And the mountains. She had seen mountains from the train, but seeing them from a train window was like seeing a lion in a painting. Standing here in the open with the peaks rising on every side like the walls of a cathedral built by something older than God was entirely different. The mountains did not care about her. They did not know she existed, and yet they were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Ridgewater itself was less impressive. A town of perhaps 400 souls, most of them connected to the cattle industry that sustained the valley. One main street, a rutted stretch of packed earth flanked by wooden buildings with false fronts. The general store, the Lucky Strike's saloon, a white clapboard church, a livery stable, a land office, houses and cabins spreading outward like scattered seeds. It smelled of horse manure and wood smoke and something sharper, the mineral tang of mountain water. Clara stood in the street in her navy blue traveling dress, her carpet bag in one hand, her bonnet slightly askew from the journey, and she looked exactly like what she was, a fish pulled from its water, a city girl in a frontier town, a bride without a groom in sight. Agnes Pruitt noticed first. She was sweeping the porch of the general store, a ritual she performed not for cleanliness, but for intelligence gathering, and her broom stopped mid-stroke. "Well, I will be," Agnes murmured. Then louder to the cluster of women near the water trough. "The Blackwood bride is here." Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Within 60 seconds, half the town was watching. Clara felt the eyes on her the way a deer feels the eyes of wolves. She had felt this before. The weight of judgment, the silent assessment of her body, her face, her worth. In Philadelphia, it had been prudence in the borders. Here it was an entire town performing the same calculation. She straightened her shoulders, a small act of defiance that cost her more than anyone watching could possibly know. She looked around for the man who had written those letters. She did not see him. What she saw instead were three men on horseback coming down the main street at a slow walk. They were the largest human beings she had ever seen in her life. The crowd parted for them. Not with respect exactly, but with the instinctive caution that smaller creatures show in the presence of something much, much larger. Whispers rippled outward like stones dropped in water. The Blackwood boys, all three of them. Lord have mercy, look at the size of them. That poor girl does not know what she has walked into. Clara watched them approach, and her heart, which had been racing all morning, seemed to stop. The first man rode in front, enormous, dark chestnut hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat, amber eyes scanning the street with the focused intensity of a hawk marking prey, a jaw that looked carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. Brown leather vest, red bandana at his throat. He did not smile. He looked at Clara the way a man looks at a map of unfamiliar territory, calculating distance, assessing risk. This was Elijah. The second man rode slightly behind and to the left, leaner than the first, hair a lighter shade honey brown and touched with sun. His expression, while guarded, carried a warmth the first man's did not. A blue bandana and no vest, hands on the reins that were long-fingered, almost elegant. When his eyes found Clara, something shifted in his face. Recognition, perhaps, or hope. This was Caleb. The third man hung back as though reluctant to be associated with the party at all. He was the tallest, the broadest, dark auburn hair, and an expression of such concentrated hostility that Clara took an involuntary step backward. Black vest, no bandana, hands on the saddle horn that were scarred and massive. This was Jasper. They stopped in front of her. Three men on horseback, towering, blocking out the sun. Clara had to tilt her head back to see their faces. She felt small. She had felt small her entire life, but this was a different kind of small. This was the smallness of standing at the base of a mountain and understanding in your bones what the mountain is and what you are not. Elijah spoke first. His voice was deep-clipped, the voice of a man who did not waste words. Miss Whitfield. Clara's mouth was dry. She nodded. I am Elijah Blackwood. These are my brothers, Caleb and Jasper. Clara blinked. She looked from one face to the next to the next. She counted them. She counted them again. Brothers, she managed. The arrangement was made under my name. Elijah continued as though this were a perfectly normal thing to say to a woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a single man. But the ranch is shared. We all live there. We all work there. You will be. He paused. For the first time, discomfort crossed his features. You will be part of the household. The silence that followed was a living thing. It spread through the street like a stain, touching everyone, coloring everything. From the porch of the general store, Agnes Pruitt's whisper carried like a gunshot across the quiet. 3 of them. The poor girl gets 3 of them. And then the laughter began. It started small. A snicker from a man leaning against the hitching post. A covered mouth from a woman near the church steps. A child pointing. And then it grew the way a brush fire grows, feeding on itself, consuming everything in its path. The main street of Ridgewater filled with the particular species of laughter that Clara Whitfield knew better than any other sound on earth. The laughter of people who are grateful that someone else's humiliation has provided their entertainment. Look at her face. She had no idea. 3 mountain men for 1 little mail-order bride. That is more husband than any woman needs. Or once looking at those 3, Clara's cheeks burned crimson, her vision blurred, her knuckles turned white around the handle of the carpet bag. Every nerve in her body screamed the same word, run. She should run. Every instinct, every year of abuse and mockery and self-doubt told her to turn around, climb back into the stagecoach, and disappear. Go back east. Go anywhere. Go nowhere. Just go. But Clara Whitfield had nowhere to go. This is what the crowd did not understand. This is what Aunt Prudence had never understood. This is what even the 3 men on horseback before her could not comprehend. Clara's courage was not the absence of fear. It was the product of having no other option. She was brave because retreat was not available to her. She had no money for a return ticket. She had no home to return to. She had no family, no friends, no safety net of any kind. The only direction available to her was forward, into the unknown, into the mountains, into the company of 3 strangers who were as terrified of her as she was of them, though they would rather die than admit it. And so Clara Whitfield did the bravest thing she had ever done. She lifted her chin, she met Elijah Blackwood's amber eyes, and she said in a voice that trembled but did not break, I came a long way, Mr. Blackwood. I would like to see this ranch of yours before the day is out, if it is all the same to you. The laughter faltered. Agnes Pruitt's broom went still. Even the wind seemed to pause as though the mountains themselves were listening. Elijah stared at her. A long beat. 2. Then so briefly that Clara might have imagined it, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something smaller. Something closer to respect. All right then, he said. He dismounted and reached for her trunk. Let us go. The ride up the mountain took nearly 2 hours. The trail was steep, narrow, and terrifying. Switchbacks carved into the mountainside with sheer drops on one side and walls of granite on the other. The mules pulled the wagon with slow, deliberate steps, their hooves finding purchase on ground that seemed designed to reject it. Clara sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat, her hands gripping the wooden bench, her stomach lurching with every turn. Her trunk rocked behind her, and she was dimly aware that if it shifted, it would take the wagon with it and send them all tumbling into the valley below. Elijah rode ahead on his horse, a dark figure against the pale trail navigating by memory and muscle. Jasper brought up the rear as far from the wagon as he could manage without losing sight of it entirely. His silence was louder than the wind. The pines rose around them like the pillars of a cathedral. Their scent was sharp and clean, unlike anything Clara had ever smelled. A hawk circled overhead, riding invisible currents of air with a patience that seemed almost contemptuous. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the clop of hooves, and the whisper of wind through 10,000 needles. Caleb was the one who finally spoke. His voice was quiet, careful, as though he was testing the air between them. "I'm sorry about this town. They are not kind to strangers. They are not kind to anyone from what I could see," Clara replied, and she was surprised by the edge in her own voice. She had not intended sharpness, but the laughter still rang in her ears, and she was tired of swallowing her own words. Caleb glanced at her, a quick assessing look that held something like admiration. "No," he agreed, "they are not." Silence settled between them again, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Softer, less guarded. Clara watched the tree pass and gathered her courage. "The letters," she said. "The man who wrote them. Which one of you was that?" Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. The leather creaked. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I wrote them." Clara turned to look at him fully. His profile was sharp against the mountain sky. Strong jaw, gentle mouth, eyes fixed on the trail ahead with the desperate focus of a man who cannot bear to be seen. "You wrote them," she repeated. "But the arrangement is in Elijah's name. As the eldest, the legal documents required his signature. I placed the advertisement. I wrote the letters. He stopped, swallowed. "I should have told you the truth, Miss Whitfield. I wanted to. Every letter I wanted to write the words, 'It is me. It is Caleb. I am the one asking about your favorite book. I am the one who cares about the answer.' But I was afraid." His voice cracked just slightly, the hairline fracture in a foundation that had held too much weight for too long. "If I had told you there were 3 of us, you would not have come, and I could not bear that." Clara stared at him, the letter in her pocket. "I see the first star, and I think of you." Those words came from this man, this quiet, gentle man with the careful hands and the warm eyes, not from the stern leader riding ahead, not from the furious giant behind. She did not know what to feel. Relief because the man who wrote those letters was real and kind and sitting beside her. Betrayal because she had been deceived. Terror because regardless of who had written the letters, she was still riding into the mountains with 3 strangers. All of it. She felt all of it simultaneously, each emotion layered on top of the others, like snow on a mountain, and she could not separate them any more than she could separate the snow from the stone beneath it. "Does Elijah know you wrote them?" she asked. "He knows I placed the advertisement. He does not know what I said in the letters, how much of myself I put into them." And Jasper, Caleb's expression tightened. "Jasper thinks the whole thing is a mistake. He did not want you here. He is not a bad man, Miss Whitfield. He is just afraid. We all are in our own way." Clara turned back to the trail. The ranch was coming into view now, the roof of the house visible above the tree line, smoke rising from the chimney into the pale sky. Her new home, her new life, her new family. 3 men she did not know in a place she had never been, at the top of a mountain she could not descend alone. She took a deep breath. The air tasted of pine and snow, and the sharp, clean edge of something she could not name. Possibility, perhaps, or the absence of everything she had known before. "Clara," she said. Caleb looked at her confused. "My name is Clara. If we are to be whatever we are to be, you should call me Clara." For the first time, Caleb Blackwood smiled. It was not a small smile. It transformed his face entirely, the guarded caution falling away like a mask removed. And what remained beneath it was a warmth so genuine, so unguarded, that Clara's chest ached with a pain that was not pain at all. Clara, he repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it sweet. Welcome to Blackwood Ridge. Behind them unseen, Jasper watched the exchange from his horse. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw tightened and he pulled his hat lower over his eyes as though blocking out a light he was not yet ready to face. The ranch house was larger than Clara expected. 2 stories with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a pantry, and 4 bedrooms upstairs. It was also, to put it as diplomatically as possible, a catastrophe. The floors were gritty with tracked-in dirt. The windows were clouded with dust and grease. The kitchen table was scarred and sticky with years of spilled meals never properly cleaned. The stove looked as though it had not been scrubbed since the beginning of the decade. Animal antlers were mounted on every available wall surface, and the furniture appeared to have been constructed by someone who understood the concept of chairs, but disagreed fundamentally with the concept of comfort. Clara stood in the doorway, carpet bag in hand, and surveyed her new home. She searched for a word that was honest without being devastating: spacious. Behind her, Elijah made a sound that might have been a cough or might have been a laugh. It was impossible to tell. Your room is upstairs, end of the hall. It was. He stopped abruptly. The pause carried weight like a stone dropped into deep water. It was our mother's room, Caleb finished quietly. Elijah reached into his coat pocket and produced a key. Iron old, worn smooth by years of handling, he held it out to Clara without ceremony. Door locks from the inside, use it. 4 words, but Clara heard what lived beneath them. You are safe here. We know what this looks like. 3 men, 1 woman, a mountain between you and the rest of the world. We are giving you what privacy we can. We are telling you in the only language we know that we will not harm you. She took the key. Their fingers did not touch. She climbed the stairs alone. The hallway was narrow, lit by a single window at the far end. 3 doors on one side, 1 on the other at the very end. She unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was small but clean. Cleaner than anything else in the house, as though someone had recently scrubbed it with purpose. The bed was narrow, covered with a quilt that was old but carefully preserved. A wedding ring pattern in faded blue and white. There was a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, a small mirror with a crack running through it like a river on a map, and a wooden chair beside the window. The window looked out over the meadow, and beyond the meadow, the mountains. In the evening light, the peaks turned gold, exactly as the letter had described. Exactly as Caleb had written. On the washstand, someone had placed a jar of wildflowers. Mountain asters, purple and gold. The stems were cut unevenly, clearly by hands more accustomed to ropes and reins than to flowers. Clara set down her carpet bag. She reached out and touched the petals gently. They were real. They were there. Someone had climbed this mountain, picked these flowers, put them in water, and set them in this room for her. For a stranger. For a woman who had not yet arrived and might not be wanted when she did. Her eyes filled, and then the tears came. Not the quiet, restrained tears she was accustomed to. Clara had learned to cry silently at the boarding house, pressing her face into the pillow so the sound would not carry through the thin walls and give Prudence another reason to sneer. These were different tears, deep, wrenching. They came from somewhere below her ribs, from a place she had kept locked for so long, she had forgotten what was stored there. She cried for her parents dead 15 years, for the fire that had taken them, for the 7-year-old girl who had stood in the street in her nightgown, watching the building burn, waiting for someone to come out. No one came out. She cried for her childhood stolen by Prudence's cruelty, for the floors she had scrubbed, the meals she had cooked, the insults she had absorbed like blows. She cried for the letters, for the man who had written them, who had asked about her favorite book and actually wanted to know the answer, for the 2 other men she had not expected, for the mountains she could not descend alone, for the wildflowers in the jar, And then she stopped. She wiped her face with the hem of her traveling dress. She stood up. She smoothed the quilt. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror. You came here, she said to her reflection. So be here. It was not courage exactly. It was something smaller and more stubborn. The refusal to collapse. The insistence on standing up one more time. Clara Whitfield had been standing up one more time her entire life. It was the only skill Aunt Prudence ever taught her, though she did not intend to. Clara unpacked her carpet bag, changed into a simpler dress, cream-colored, practical, pinned her hair back, squared her shoulders. Then she went downstairs to cook dinner. The pantry revealed salt pork, dried beans, flour coffee, and an alarming quantity of canned peaches. Evidence that the brothers' diet had been limited to approximately 4 items for an extended period. Clara surveyed the inventory with the calm assessment of a general evaluating supplies before a campaign. She made biscuits. They were not excellent biscuits. The stove ran too hot on one side and barely warm on the other, and the altitude did something unpredictable to the leavening that she would need time to understand. But they were biscuits. They were not beans. And when she set them on the table alongside a stew assembled, from whatever she could find, the reaction from the brothers told her everything she needed to know. Elijah ate steadily, methodically, without comment, but he took 3 biscuits. 3. He reached for the third one without looking up, as though his hand made the decision without consulting his brain. This, Clara would learn, was the highest compliment Elijah Blackwood was capable of paying. Caleb smiled at her across the table, that warm, transforming smile. This is wonderful, Clara. The use of her first name in front of his brothers was deliberate, a small flag planted in new territory. I know her. She is real to me. She has a name, and I have spoken it. Jasper did not come to dinner. His place at the table sat empty, the chair pushed back as though he had considered sitting and then changed his mind. Through the kitchen window, Clara could see the barn door standing open, lamplight spilling out onto the dirt yard in a yellow rectangle. He was out there, alone, choosing hunger over her company. The insult stung, but Clara said nothing. She had decades of practice at eating meals in the company of people who did not want her there. This was merely a geographical variation on the same old theme. After dinner, Elijah washed his own plate. Clara suspected this was not his usual practice. He paused at the foot of the stairs. Door locks from the inside, he said, again not looking at her. Then he was gone. Heavy boots on the stairs, a door closing above. Caleb lingered, helping her clear the table in a silence that felt companionable rather than awkward. Give Jasper time, he said softly, reading the hurt she was trying to hide. Does he hate me? Clara asked. And she hated the smallness in her own voice, the child's voice, the voice that asked Prudence why and received only cruelty in return. He hates that you are here, Caleb said honestly. There is a difference. He is afraid of what you represent. Change, attachment, the possibility of losing someone again. Caleb paused, choosing his words with the care of a man selecting stones for a foundation. We all lost our mother, but Jasper was 6. He remembers her least, and that is the cruelest part. He grieves a woman he can barely recall, and he is terrified of caring for someone new, because he knows how it ends. Clara absorbed this. She thought of her own mother, a face she could barely picture, a voice she could only remember in fragments, a hand on her hair in the dark soothing her after a nightmare saying words she could no longer hear. She understood Jasper's fear more than Caleb knew. There is something else, Clara said carefully. A room, at the end of the upstairs hall opposite mine. It is locked. Caleb's expression shifted. The warmth dimmed like a lamp turned down. That was our mother's ordering room. Elijah keeps it locked. Her things are in there, her clothes, her personal belongings. None of us go in. Why not? Because Elijah does not want us to. And in this family, what Elijah says is what happens. He set the last plate down, nodded goodnight, and climbed the stairs. His footsteps were lighter than Elijah's, quieter, as though he moved through the world trying not to disturb it. Clara stood alone in the kitchen. The embers in the stove glowed orange. The mountains beyond the window were black shapes against a blacker sky, and the stars above them were more numerous than Clara had ever imagined stars could be. In Philadelphia, the sky held a handful of stars on a clear night. Here the sky was made of stars. They filled every inch of darkness, thick and bright, and Clara understood for the first time why the letter had mentioned them. I see the first star, and I think of you. She thought about the locked room across from hers. She thought about the letters. She thought about Jasper's empty chair and Elijah's rigid courtesy and Caleb's gentle eyes and the wildflowers in the jar upstairs. She had come to the end of the world she knew, and the world she had entered was full of doors, some locked, some open, all leading somewhere she could not see. The following week settled into a rhythm that Clara recognized as survival. She rose before dawn, a habit from the boarding house that served her well here. She made coffee strong and black the way Elijah liked it. She fed the chickens, scattering grain in the cold morning air, while the hens rushed toward her in a feathered stampede. She swept the porch. She scrubbed the floors. She attacked the house with a ferocity that surprised even her. And within a week, the windows were clean, the kitchen was organized, the stove was scrubbed, and the main room looked less like a bear's den and more like a place where human beings lived. This was not generosity. It was calculation. Clara needed to be useful. Useful people were not sent away. This was the lesson Prudence had taught her, the one lesson that had value. Make yourself indispensable, and they cannot throw you out. Elijah treated her with scrupulous courtesy and absolute distance. He thanked her for meals. He informed her of weather conditions that might affect her tasks. He did not ask personal questions. He did not touch her, did not stand too close, did not linger in rooms she occupied. He was building a wall of propriety between them, careful and deliberate, and Clara understood it for what it was. Not coldness, but fear. Elijah Blackwood was terrified of this woman in his house in his mother's room, sleeping under his mother's quilt. He had spent 20 years constructing a life in which no one could get close enough to wound him, and Clara's presence threatened every wall he had built. Caleb was the brother who made the transition bearable. He taught her how to draw water from the well without straining her back, how to churn butter, how to identify the wild herbs that grew in the meadow yarrow for wounds, mint for tea, sage for cooking. He showed her his wood carvings shyly as though expecting her to laugh. She held the little wooden dough in her hands and turned it slowly, studying the delicate lines, the way the grain of the wood flowed along the curve of the animal's neck. "You made this," she said. "This is beautiful." The look on Caleb's face nearly broke her. Surprised, grateful, painfully vulnerable. The look of a man who has made something with his hands and been told for the first time that it has value. And Jasper. Jasper remained her antagonist. He did not eat at her table. He did not speak to her. When they passed in the hallway or the yard, he turned his face away. But Clara was observant. She had spent a lifetime watching cataloging, reading the small truths that people revealed without meaning to. And she noticed things. She noticed that Jasper's boots appeared by the back door each morning, already caked with mud from chores he had done before anyone else woke. She noticed that the wood box beside the stove, which she emptied every evening, was full again by morning, though she never heard anyone fill it. She noticed that when she mentioned needing flour, it appeared in the pantry the next day. No one claimed credit. No one acknowledged the act. Jasper's cruelty was loud. His kindness was silent. And Clara began to understand that these were not contradictions, but two halves of the same coin. Jasper could not reconcile his need to protect with his need to keep distance. So he did both. He pushed her away with one hand and caught her with the other, hoping she would not notice either. One evening, Clara left a plate of food outside the barn door. She did not knock. She did not speak. She simply set the plate on the bench, turned, and walked back to the house. The next morning, the plate sat clean on the kitchen windowsill. This became their ritual. Clara cooked. She left food at the barn. Jasper ate. He returned the plate. Not a single word was exchanged, but the plates were always clean, and sometimes tucked beneath them there was a wildflower. Clara did not mention the flowers. She pressed them between the pages of her Bible and said nothing. Some conversations are too fragile for words. Some bridges can only be built in silence. 3 weeks after her arrival, Clara made her first return to Ridgewater. She needed supplies the ranch did not have. Fabric for curtains, needles, soap, writing paper. Caleb drove her in the wagon. Elijah said nothing, which was his way of approving. Jasper stayed behind. The town had been talking about Clara since the day she arrived. Agnes Pruitt had ensured that every detail, real and embellished, had circulated through Ridgewater with the efficiency of a telegraph. Clara heard the whispers the moment the wagon rolled onto the main street. She sat rigid beside Caleb, hands folded in her lap, face burning. At the general store, Agnes greeted her with a smile that contained no warmth. "Mrs. Blackwood," Agnes called out loud enough for every customer to hear. Or should I say which Mrs. Blackwood? Such a confusing arrangement. Clara's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin, that small, stubborn gesture that had become her shield, and said with more steadiness than she felt, "Just Clara will do, Mrs. Pruitt. I will take a pound of salt if you have it." She made her purchases. She endured the stares. She walked back to the wagon with her spine straight and her eyes dry. On the street near the water trough, a small boy sat in the dirt crying. He was perhaps 8 years old, thin, with a torn shirt and a scraped knee that bled sluggishly into the dust. People walked past. A woman glanced down and kept moving. A man stepped around him without breaking stride. Nobody stopped. Clara stopped. She knelt beside the boy. She was aware of the watching eyes, aware that every whisper would multiply when she stood again. But her feet had carried her forward before her mind could intervene the way they always did, the way they always would, because Clara Whitfield's body understood kindness as instinct before her brain could calculate cost. She pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed at the scrape gently. "Let me see. There. You are brave. Nothing to be afraid of." The boy looked up at her with wide, startled eyes, brown eyes wet with tears searching her face for the trick, the catch, the cruelty that must surely follow kindness, because in his experience, kindness always had conditions. Clara cleaned his knee, tied the handkerchief around it in a neat bandage, and patted his hair. "What is your name, Tommy?" The boy sniffed. "Tommy Dawkins." "Well, Tommy Dawkins, you are very brave. And that is a fine bandage, if I say so myself." A smile, brilliant, unreserved. The smile of a child who has just discovered that the world might contain kindness without conditions. "Thank you, ma'am." Also on that visit, Clara found the shop of Maggie Odell, the former saloon girl turned seamstress. Maggie's place was small, tucked behind the Lucky Strike, filled with fabric bolts and the smell of hot tea. "You are the Blackwood bride," Maggie said from behind her cutting table. Sharp blue eyes, dark hair and a practical bun, a directness that felt like fresh air. "I have heard about you." "I imagine the whole territory has," Clara said, bracing. But Maggie surprised her. "I heard you rode into a blizzard situation to marry 3 men you never met. That takes guts." She set a spool of thread on the counter. "Most women in this town would not ride through a drizzle for a man who adored them." "Sit down. I make the best coffee in Ridgewater, and you look like you need some." Clara sat. She drank the coffee, which was excellent. And for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she had a conversation with another woman that did not leave her feeling smaller when it was over. On the ride home, the mountains turning amber in the late light, Clara was quiet for a long time. The wagon creaked. The mules plodded. The trail climbed. "They will never accept me," she said finally. "Will they?" Caleb was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the trail ahead. "It does not matter whether they do," he said softly. "It matters whether you accept yourself." Clara turned to look at him. The afternoon light caught his hair and turned it to gold. His eyes were kind, not performatively kind, not kind because kindness was expected, but kind because kindness was what he was made of. Down to the bone, down to the grain, the way the wood he carved was as grain all the way through. "I am working on it," she whispered. He nodded. "So are we." The wagon rolled upward toward the ranch, toward the mountains, toward whatever was coming next. And behind them, growing smaller with every turn of the trail, the town of Ridgewater sat in its valley full of whispers and judgment and the particular cruelty of people who fear what they do not understand. Clara did not look back. She had spent 22 years looking back at what she had lost, at who she had failed to become, at the girl in the nightgown watching the building burn. She was done looking back. The mountains were ahead. The ranch was ahead. The locked room and the letters and the three brothers, and the wildflowers in the jar, and the empty chair at the dinner table, and the clean plates on the windowsill, and whatever lay beyond all of it, whatever waited in the silence and the snow, whatever the mountain would demand, and whatever she would give. All of it ahead. Clara faced forward. The trail climbed, and she climbed with it. 6 weeks. That is how long it took for the Blackwood Ranch to become something it had not been in 20 years. A home. Clara had attacked the house the way a general attacks a fortification, systematically, relentlessly, and with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. The windows, which had been opaque with grime for so long that the brothers had forgotten windows were meant to be seen through, now caught the morning light and threw it across scrubbed pine floors and golden rectangles. The kitchen, once a landscape of sticky surfaces and mysterious stains, was organized with a precision that made Caleb smile and made Elijah uneasy because order implied permanence, and permanence implied that she was staying, and if she was staying, then he would have to reckon with what that meant, and Elijah Blackwood was not yet ready to reckon with anything. Curtains hung in the windows. Clara had sewn them herself from fabric bought in Ridgewater, cream-colored cotton, with a simple blue border, and their presence transformed the main room from a cave into a dwelling. Herbs grew in a wooden box on the porch. Mint and sage and thyme, their green, a defiant splash of life against the gray, weathered wood. The stove, scrubbed and seasoned, produced meals that bore no resemblance to the monotonous rotation of salt pork and beans that had sustained the brothers for the better part of a decade. Even Jasper ate at the table now. This development had occurred gradually in stages so small that no single moment could be identified as the turning point. First, the plates left at the barn door returned clean. Then the plates left on the kitchen windowsill with flowers tucked beneath. Then one evening, without announcement or explanation, Jasper appeared in the doorway at supper time, sat at the far end of the table and ate in silence. He did not speak. He did not look at Clara. He consumed his food with the focused efficiency of a man refueling a machine and then left without a word. But he was there, at the table, in the same room. By the standards of Jasper Blackwood, this was practically an embrace. Clara registered the change and said nothing. She had learned that acknowledgement could be its own form of pressure. And pressure was the one thing guaranteed to send Jasper retreating to the barn. So she cooked. She set 4 plates. She did not comment when the 4th plate was used. She simply washed it afterward and set it out again the next night. The mountains had begun their slow descent into winter. The peaks that had been merely snow-dusted when Clara arrived were now fully white, and the tree line crept lower each week as the cold advanced downward like an invading army. Mornings came later. Evenings came sooner. The light when it appeared was thin and golden and precious, lasting only a few hours before the shadows of the western ridge swallowed the meadow whole. Clara had adjusted to the altitude, to the cold, to the isolation. She had not adjusted to the silence. In Philadelphia, there was always noise. Street vendors shouting, carriages, clattering boarders, arguing through thin walls, Prudence's voice cutting through it all like a saw through wet wood. Here the silence was a presence. It filled every room. It pressed against the windows. It lay across the meadow like snow, heavy and complete. At night, the silence was so absolute that Clara could hear her own heartbeat. And there were moments lying in the narrow bed under Margaret Blackwood's faded quilt, when she felt that the silence was not empty, but full of things unsaid, full of ghosts. The locked room across the hall pulled at her. She passed it every morning and every evening. The heavy oak door, the iron padlock, the dust undisturbed on the threshold. Caleb had told her it was their mother's sewing room, that Elijah kept it locked, that none of them went inside. He had said this in a tone that closed the subject like a lid closing on a box, and Clara had respected the boundary. But curiosity is not a thing that respects boundaries. Curiosity is a vine that grows in the dark, slowly, persistently, finding cracks in walls that appear solid. And the locked room had cracks. Clara could feel them. Something was in that room that the brothers did not want found. Something that mattered. The discovery happened on a Tuesday. Clara was sweeping the upstairs hallway, working the broom into the corners with the thoroughness that defined everything she did, when the bristles caught on a loose floorboard near the locked door. She knelt to press it back into place, and her fingers brushed something beneath it. Hard, cold, wrapped in a scrap of cloth. A key. She held it in her palm. It was smaller than the key Elijah had given her for her bedroom. Older, darker, with tarnish, as though it had been hidden for years rather than weeks. She looked at the locked door. She should put it back. She knew this with the same certainty she knew the sun would rise tomorrow. This was not her room. These were not her secrets. She was a guest in this house, an arrangement, a transaction. She had no right. But Clara Whitfield had never been good at knowing her place. If she had been good at knowing her place, she would still be scrubbing floors in Philadelphia, head-bowed, voice swallowed invisible. She was here on a mountain in Montana, married in some fashion to three men she barely knew precisely, because she had refused to stay where she was put. She turned the key in the lock. The room was small, dusty, filled with the preserved remains of a woman who had been dead for 22 years. A dress form stood in the corner like a headless sentinel, draped in a shawl that moths had laced with tiny holes. Bolts of fabric leaned against the wall, their colors faded by 2 decades of sunlight filtering through the single window. A sewing basket sat on a small table, needles and threads still arranged as though Margaret Blackwood had set them down, intending to return in an hour. A rocking chair faced the window. Beside it, a cradle hand carved pushed against the wall. The craftsmanship was beautiful, similar to Caleb's work, but rougher, older. Made by different hands, made by a father who was gone. And on the sewing table, wrapped in oilcloth, as though someone had taken care to protect it from the dust that covered everything else, a diary. Clara picked it up. The leather cover was soft with age. The pages inside were covered in a woman's handwriting, neat and careful, the letter slanting slightly to the right. The ink had faded from black to brown, but the words were legible. She knew she should not read it. She opened it anyway. Margaret Blackwood's diary covered the last 2 years of her life. From her arrival in Montana as a mail-order bride from Virginia at the age of 29 to her death from fever at 31. The early entries were bright, full of wonder, full of the breathless discovery of a woman encountering a landscape that exceeded anything she had imagined. "The mountains are beyond description," Margaret had written in her first week. "I have tried and failed. They make me feel small, but not in the way I felt small in Virginia, where smallness meant insignificance. Here, smallness means proportion. I am small because the world is vast and the vastness is beautiful, and being part of something beautiful, even a small part, is enough." She wrote about Josiah with the tenderness of a woman newly in love. His strength, his quiet humor, the way his hands, so large they could span her entire waist, could also whittle a cradle from a single block of pine with a delicacy that made her weep. She wrote about the birth of Elijah, then Caleb, then Jasper, each entry more exhausted than the last, more stretched, but still threaded with joy. And then the joy began to thin. Midway through the diary, the entries changed. The handwriting was the same, but the words had darkened the way a sky darkens before a storm. The wonder remained, but it was joined by something else, something heavier. "Josiah left again this morning, the trap lines in the high country. He will be gone 3 weeks, perhaps 4. The boys and I are alone. Elijah is old enough to help, but Caleb is only 4 and Jasper is still nursing. I have not spoken to an adult in 11 days. I counted. I should not count. 2 pages later. I love my boys with everything I am, but I am disappearing. The mountain takes everything. My voice, my name, myself. I am no longer Margaret. I am only mother, only wife, only a pair of hands that work from dawn to dark. I asked Josiah to take us to town for the winter. He said the mountain is our home, but it is not a home. It is a prison made of beauty, and the bars are made of silence. Clara read with her hands trembling. She read with the feeling of looking into a mirror and seeing not her own reflection, but a reflection of what she might become. A woman alone on a mountain, surrounded by beauty and suffocated by it, loved but not seen, needed but not known. The final entries were written in a hand that shook. The letters grew larger, less precise, as though Margaret's body was failing alongside her spirit. The cough will not clear. I am warm when I should be cold, and cold when I should be warm. I know what this means. I have seen it before in Virginia, the way the body turns traitor, and the fever rises at night like a tide. And then the last entry, the one that stopped Clara's breath. I know who is responsible for my loneliness, not Josiah. He loves me in the only way he knows, which is the way the mountain loves the snow. Completely, silently, without ever asking if the snow wants to be loved that way. No, what is killing me is not a person. It is this mountain, this silence, this beauty that does not care whether I live or die. I want to go home. God forgive me, I want to go back to Virginia. But there is no going back. There is only this room and this window and these mountains and my boys sleeping in the next room and the sound of nothing, nothing, nothing. Clara closed the diary. She sat in Margaret's rocking chair, in Margaret's room, with Margaret's words ringing in her skull like a bell struck in an empty church. She stared out Margaret's window at Margaret's mountains and felt the weight of a dead woman's sorrow settle on her shoulders like a quilt made of stone. She was Margaret's echo. 22 years later, a different woman, the same mountain, the same silence, the same isolation. But there was a difference. Clara saw it clearly, even through her fear. Margaret had been alone, truly alone. Josiah was gone for weeks at a time, and when he was present the way the mountain was present, massive and silent and oblivious to the damage his silence caused. Margaret had no one to talk to, no one to see her, no one to notice that she was disappearing. Clara had 3 men, 3 imperfect, damaged, infuriating men who were each in their own broken way learning to see her. She had Caleb, who asked about her favorite books and listened to her answers. She had Elijah, who set 4 plates at the table and locked the door from the inside and said, "You are useful," in a voice that meant something much larger than useful. She had Jasper, who left wildflowers under clean plates and shot mountain lions out of the air and could not say her name without flinching. She was not Margaret. She would not become Margaret, because the thing that had killed Margaret was not the mountain or the cold or the fever. It was the silence. And Clara Whitfield intended to break it. She closed the diary, rewrapped it in its oilcloth, and placed it back on the sewing table. She locked the door behind her. She slipped the key back under the floorboard, and she went downstairs to make dinner with a new understanding of the house she lived in, the men she lived with, and the ghost whose room she slept across from every night. The weeks that followed changed everything. Clara did not tell the brothers about the diary. The guilt of having invaded their privacy pressed on her like a hand on her chest, but the knowledge she had gained pressed harder. She watched the brothers differently now. She watched for signs. In Elijah, she watched for his father's blindness, the inability to see the person standing right in front of him because the landscape behind her was too large and too consuming. In Caleb, she watched for the passive gentleness that allowed problems to grow because confrontation was too painful. In Jasper, she watched for the rage that masked grief, the fire that burned because the alternative was freezing. And she watched herself for signs of Margaret, for the slow erosion of self that begins not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet surrender, the daily decision to say nothing, to need nothing, to make yourself so small that you disappear. She would not disappear. She had promised herself this in Margaret's rocking chair, and she intended to keep the promise. Instead, she grew. Caleb taught her to ride, not just to sit on a horse which she could manage after a fashion, but to communicate with the animal, to feel its rhythm and match her body to its movement. The lessons took place in the meadow in the early mornings when the frost was still on the grass and the light came slanting through the pines at an angle that turned everything gold. "You are gripping too hard," Caleb said on the third morning, walking alongside the mare while Clara sat rigid in the saddle, her knuckles white on the reins. "The horse can feel your fear. She responds to it. If you are tense, she is tense. I am sitting on top of 1,000 pounds of animal that could throw me off a mountain," Clara said through clenched teeth. "Tension seems appropriate." Caleb smiled. That smile. "You cannot control everything, Clara. Sometimes you have to trust what is beneath you." She looked at him. He was not talking about the horse. She knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them said so. That was the language they had developed, she and Caleb. A language of metaphor and implication, where the most important things were said sideways through the safe medium of horses and wood carvings in the weather. She loosened her grip. The mare, sensing the change, softened beneath her. Her stride became smoother, longer. Clara's body found the rhythm. And for one brief, extraordinary moment, she was not afraid. She was not on a mountain with three strange men. She was not an orphan or a burden or a mail-order bride. She was a woman on a horse in a meadow in Montana, and the wind was in her hair, and the mountains were vast and beautiful, and they did not judge her, and the man walking beside her was kind. "Better," Caleb said softly. "Much better." Their conversations deepened as the weeks passed. Caleb told her about Rose, the girl in Ridgewater he had loved and never proposed to, and the telling cost him something visible. His face changed as he spoke, the habitual gentleness giving way to a rawness that made Clara's chest ache. "I was afraid," he said one evening on the porch, the sun setting behind the peaks in shades of amber and violet. "Afraid that if I asked and she said yes, I would have to choose between her and my brothers. And if she said no, you would know for certain that you were not enough," Clara finished. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on anyone's face before. The expression of a man who has been carrying a stone for years and has just met someone willing to help him set it down. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." "I understand that fear," Clara said. "I have lived in it my whole life." They sat in silence, watching the sky turn from gold to violet to deep, depthless blue. The first star appeared. Caleb's hand rested on the porch railing inches from hers. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. The distance between their fingers was enough. The acknowledgement that the distance existed and that it was chosen rather than imposed was its own kind of intimacy. Elijah's thaw was slower. It came not through conversation but through competence, which was the only currency Elijah respected. The turning point arrived on a morning when Clara found him at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, radiating a frustration so intense that the air around him seemed to vibrate. 3 more sections of fence had been found cut on the western boundary. Another 6 head of cattle were gone. This was not wildlife damage. The cuts were clean, precise, made with wire cutters by someone who knew the property. Clara set a cup of coffee in front of him. He did not look up. "How many head can you afford to lose?" she asked. The question landed like a stone in still water. Elijah raised his eyes. They were bloodshot, rimmed with the particular exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of responsibility that never lets up, never lightens, never allows a moment of rest. Nobody asked Elijah Blackwood practical questions. They asked if he was all right. They told him to rest. They offered sympathy. None of these things were useful. None of them addressed the actual problem. But Clara's question was different. It was the question of a partner. The question of someone who understood that survival was arithmetic, that a ranch was a ledger, and that the ledger had to balance or everything fell apart. 12 more and we cannot make the winter," he said. Then we cannot afford to lose 12 more. Clara sat across from him. Show me the property lines. Show me where the fence was cut. I want to understand. Elijah stared at her. Behind his eyes, something shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but recognition. The recognition that Clara was not a burden he was obligated to house or a problem his brother had created for him to solve. She was offering to carry the weight beside him, not behind him, beside him. He spread the ranch map on the table and began to explain. From that morning forward, Elijah included Clara in the operational decisions of the ranch. He did not do this graciously. He was gruff, impatient, and expected her to keep up. But he did it. Clara kept the accounts in her careful, elegant handwriting. She inventoried supplies. She suggested planting a vegetable garden in the spring to reduce dependence on town provisions. Each suggestion was practical, intelligent, and delivered without apology. One evening, after a long discussion about winter feed, Elijah paused at the kitchen door. He did not turn around. "You are useful, Clara," he said. Then after a beat that lasted long enough for Clara to feel the weight of what was coming, "More than useful." He left before she could respond. Clara smiled in the empty kitchen. A real smile, wide and surprised, because she understood that from Elijah Blackwood, those 4 words were the equivalent of a symphony. And then there was Jasper. The change in Jasper did not begin with Clara. It began with Tommy Dawkins. The motherless boy from Ridgewater had started appearing at the ranch, hiking up the mountain trail alone. An 8-year-old's determination defeating distance and danger and the basic common sense that should have prevented a child from making a 2-hour climb through bear country without an adult. He came for Clara. Clara, who had bandaged his knee on the street in Ridgewater. Clara, who was the closest thing to a mother he had known since his own, had died of consumption 3 years ago. Clara fed him. She patched his clothes. She taught him his letters on a slate she had found in the pantry, sitting with him on the porch while the afternoon light stretched across the meadow. Tommy's head would lean against her shoulder as he concentrated, his small tongue poking between his teeth, and Clara would rest her hand on his hair and feel something open in her chest, something that had been closed so long she had forgotten it existed. Jasper watched. He watched from the barn door, from the far edge of the meadow. From the corner of the porch where he sat sharpening a knife with long, slow strokes. He watched Clara kneel in the dirt to tie the boy's bootlaces. He watched her read to him, her voice rising and falling, with the story, the boy's face tilted up toward hers like a flower toward light. He watched her send Tommy home with food wrapped in cloth and a new word scratched on his slate, her hand gentle on his hair as he turned to wave from the tree line. And something in Jasper Blackwood cracked, because Tommy Dawkins was Jasper at 6 years old, a boy whose mother had died, whose father had disappeared into work and distance, who was alone in a world that did not particularly want him, but had not yet found a reason to throw him out. Tommy was Jasper's past, walking up the mountain trail every Tuesday and Thursday, asking for the thing Jasper had wanted more than anything and never received. A woman's hand on his hair, a warm voice reading stories, the simple annihilating comfort of being seen. Jasper did not acknowledge this. He could not. The machinery of his defenses was too deeply built, too load-bearing, too essential to the structure of his personality. Admitting that he needed what Tommy needed would mean admitting that the need had been there all along, unmet, unsatisfied, and the pain of that admission was more than he could face. But the hostility dimmed. The sullen silence at the dinner table softened into something merely quiet. He began leaving his plate on the table instead of in the barn. He grunted when Clara said good morning, a sound that in the vocabulary of Jasper Blackwood constituted conversation. The real breakthrough came in the hen house. Clara was gathering eggs on a cold morning, her breath making small clouds in the air, the hens clucking irritably at the intrusion. She reached under a particularly temperamental Rhode Island red and was extracting an egg when she heard it. A sound that did not belong. Low, guttural, a rumble that vibrated in her chest before her ears fully registered it. She turned her head slowly. The mountain lion crouched on the henhouse roof. Its body was flattened against the rough shingles muscles. coiled tail twitching with the slow, rhythmic patience of a predator that has already decided to strike. Its eyes were yellow, fixed on her, unblinking. Claire had never seen a mountain lion before, had never seen any predatory animal larger than a Philadelphia rat, and in the first second, she did not fully understand what she was looking at. In the second second, she understood completely. She froze. Her body understood the danger before her mind could form words for it. Every muscle locked. Her lungs stopped. The egg in her hand, warm and fragile, might as well have been the last thing she would ever hold. She could not move. She could not scream. She could not do anything at all except stand perfectly still while a 200-pound cat calculated the distance between the roof and her throat. The rifle shot split the morning like the crack of God's own whip. The mountain lion jerked sideways. It was dead before it left the roof, before gravity pulled it off the shingles and sent it tumbling to the ground 2 feet from where Clara stood, a hole in its skull and its yellow eyes already going dull. Jasper stood 20 yards away. The rifle still smoked in his hands. His face was white. Not with exertion, the shot had been effortless. The product of a lifetime of shooting, the kind of marksmanship that does not require thought, because it has moved past thought into something deeper. His face was white with something else entirely. His face was white with terror. He strode to the hen house. He stood over Clara, chest heaving, the rifle still in his hands, and looked down at her with an expression that stripped away every layer of hostility and armor and carefully constructed indifference he had maintained for the past 6 weeks. "Are you hurt?" His voice was raw, cracked, broken open. "No," Clara whispered. "No, I am. You do not go near the hen house without a weapon," he said, and the words came out fierce, almost violent, driven by a force that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the panic that was still flooding his system like ice water. "You understand me? Never. Not without a rifle, not without one of us nearby. The cats come down when the weather turns cold. They are hungry, they are fast. You would not have had time to scream." His hands were shaking. The rifle barrel trembled. And Clara realized with a shock that went through her like lightning that Jasper Blackwood was afraid. Not of the mountain lion. He had killed the mountain lion without hesitation, without thought, with the casual precision of a man swatting a fly. He was afraid of what would have happened if he had been 30 seconds later. He was afraid of losing her. The man who had not wanted her here, who had eaten in the barn rather than share a table with her, who had called the arrangement a fool's errand and told his brothers she should be sent back. That man had just killed a mountain lion in half a heartbeat because the thought of Clara Whitfield dying had sent a jolt of absolute terror through every nerve in his body. "Jasper," she said. It was the first time she had spoken his name directly to him. The word hung between them like a rope thrown across a chasm. He flinched. Then he turned and walked away fast, long strides eating the ground, putting distance between himself and the thing he had just revealed. That evening, Clara found a rifle leaning against the hen house door. Cleaned, oiled, loaded. A note in handwriting so rough it was barely legible. "Keep this close. I will not always be near enough." She read the note 3 times. She pressed it into her Bible alongside the dried wildflowers and said nothing. But that night, lying in the narrow bed under Margaret's quilt, she held the note against her chest and felt something she had never felt before. Not love exactly, something that preceded love. The recognition that she mattered to someone who had tried very hard not to let her matter. Strange signs had been appearing around the ranch for weeks. First, the footprints. Clara discovered them near the barn one morning after a light frost. Boot prints pressed into the white ground, large deep, the tread of worn leather. She knew the brothers' boots by now, the way a woman learns the footsteps of the people she lives with, recognizing each one by weight and rhythm. These were not theirs. These prints came from the tree line circled the barn, approached the house to within 30 feet of the porch, and then retreated back into the forest. She told Elijah. His face went hard. He checked the perimeter, found where the tracks disappeared into the pine litter, and returned with nothing. Then the carved flower appeared. Clara found it on the porch railing one morning, a small wooden blossom, an aster, each petal shaped with a precision that spoke of years of practice. She held it up in the kitchen light and turned it slowly. The style was similar to Caleb's work, but different, rougher, older. The technique of someone who had carved wood decades before Caleb was born. Then the fire on the ridge, a point of orange light visible from the porch after dark, flickering on the high saddle between two peaks. Too steady for lightning, too small for a forest fire. A campfire. Someone was up there, watching. Elijah said nothing, but Clara noticed him checking his rifle each night. Caleb grew quieter. Jasper began patrolling the property line at dawn, rifle across his shoulder, his eyes scanning the tree line with a predatory focus that was more animal than human. Someone was out there. Someone was close. Clara wrote it all down in a small notebook she kept in her apron pocket. Dates, locations, details. She did not yet know who was watching them, but she knew with the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent her life being observed that whoever it was had been there for a long time. The November blizzard came on a Tuesday. The sky had been gray all morning, the clouds low and heavy pressing down on the valley like a lid on a pot. The air had a metallic taste that Clara did not yet know to associate with heavy snowfall. Elijah had looked at the sky at breakfast and frowned, but he had not said the word blizzard because the word had been unnecessary. They all knew. Jasper left at dawn to check the fence line on the high pasture, the most remote section of the ranch, a 2-hour ride from the house at an elevation where the weather was always worse and always faster. He went alone because he always went alone, because solitude was the medium in which Jasper Blackwood was most comfortable, and because none of them had understood not yet that the weather was about to try to kill them. The storm hit at noon. It did not arrive gradually. It arrived the way a wall arrives when you are falling. One moment the world was gray and still. The next the wind screamed down the valley with a force that bent the pines sideways and turned the air white. Snow did not fall. Snow attacked. It came horizontal, driven by a wind that found every crack, every gap, every weakness in the world and exploited it. Visibility dropped to 10 feet, then 5, then nothing. The world ceased to exist beyond the length of Clara's arm. Elijah and Caleb were in the barn when it hit. They secured the horses and the cattle, fighting the wind, to close the barn doors and then battled their way back to the house through snow that was already ankle-deep and climbing. They came through the kitchen door, covered in white ice in their hair, and the fear on Elijah's face was something Clara had never seen before and hoped never to see again. "Where is Jasper?" she asked, though she already knew. "High pasture," Elijah said. His voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man who is controlling his voice because if he does not control it, it will break. "He left at dawn." "The cabin. Is there a cabin up there?" "A line shack. We keep it stocked for emergencies. If he reached it before the storm." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Caleb stood by the stove, his face white. "We wait, the storm will break, and we go up." He could be hurt. He could be out in the open. "And if you ride out in this, you die, both of you. Then what?" The brothers faced each other across the kitchen, and the argument between them was not about strategy or logistics. It was about the thing that had defined this family for 20 years. Loss. The fear of it. The weight of it. The absolute certainty that the people you love will be taken from you, and the paralysis that comes from knowing you cannot prevent it. Clara put on her coat. Both brothers turned to stare at her. "What are you doing?" Elijah demanded. "If you go, you might die, and Caleb cannot lose another brother. If you stay and Jasper is hurt, none of us can live with that. But I am lighter than either of you, and the mare knows the trail." "Absolutely not." Elijah's voice was iron. "Then come with me. You know the trail by memory. I can tend to Jasper if he is hurt. I have nursing skills. I have gentle hands. But I will not sit in this kitchen while a man who left wildflowers under my plate freezes to death on a mountain because his brothers were too afraid of the storm to go after him. The words struck the room like a physical force. Elijah's jaw worked. Something behind his eyes cracked the way ice cracks on a river in spring, the surface breaking to reveal dark water beneath. "You are not expendable," he said, and his voice shook. It was the first time Clara had heard Elijah Blackwood's voice shake. They went together, Elijah and Clara on horseback into the white. The ride was a nightmare that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. The wind tore at her coat. The snow blinded her. The trail, which had been treacherous in good weather, was invisible now, a memory under 3 inches of white. The mare stumbled twice on the ice, and both times Clara gripped the saddle with every ounce of strength in her body and did not scream. She wanted to scream. She wanted to scream more than she had ever wanted anything. But screaming would not help Jasper, and helping Jasper was the only thing that mattered. Elijah rode ahead, a dark shape in the whiteout, navigating by instinct and memory and the sheer force of his refusal to fail again. He had been 12 years old when he rode for the doctor and got lost in a storm like this one. His mother had died while he wandered in circles. He was 34 now, and he would not get lost again. He would not fail again. He would find the cabin or he would die on the trail, and either way, he would not stop moving forward. They found the line shack 2 hours later, half buried in drifts, its chimney cold, no smoke, no light. Elijah kicked the door open and they went inside. Jasper lay on the narrow bunk. His face was gray. His lips were blue. His left leg was twisted beneath him at an angle that made Clara's stomach lurch. His horse had thrown him on the icy trail, and he had crawled the last half-mile to the cabin on his hands and one good knee through snow that was trying to bury him alive. He had made it inside. He had closed the door, and then he had collapsed on the bunk, unable to build a fire, unable to do anything except lie in the cold and wait. Elijah built the fire. His hands moved with the mechanical precision of a man performing a task he has performed 1,000 times, and within minutes the small stove was throwing heat into the cabin. Clara went to work. She was efficient, calm, terrifyingly competent. She splinted Jasper's leg with kindling wood and strips torn from her own petticoat, wrapping the break with a steadiness that belied the trembling she felt inside. She heated water. She piled every blanket in the cabin on top of him. She sat beside the bunk and spooned warm broth into his mouth, a sip at a time, with the patience of a woman who understood that patience was sometimes the difference between life and death. Jasper drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, he looked at Clara with an expression she could not name: confusion, gratitude, surrender. The expression of a man who has spent years building a fortress around himself and has woken to find it occupied by someone who climbed the walls while he was sleeping. In his delirious moments, burning with fever, his eyes seeing things that were not there, he spoke in fragments, words that did not connect, names from a childhood he barely remembered. And then in a voice so small that it did not seem possible it could come from a man his size, he said a word that split Clara's heart in two: "Mama." Just that, whispered through cracked lips. A child's word from a man's mouth. The word that Jasper Blackwood had not spoken in 20 years. The word that contained everything he had lost and everything he had refused to mourn and everything he still needed buried so deep that only fever and delirium could excavate it. Clara took his hand. It was massive, scarred, burning with heat. She held it in both of hers. "I am here," she whispered. "I am not going anywhere." He gripped her hand with a strength that should not have been possible from a man in his condition. His eyes were closed. His breathing was ragged. "Do not leave," he mumbled. "They always leave." "I will not," Clara said, and she meant it with every cell in her body. Elijah sat by the fire, his face in shadow. Clara could not see his expression, but she could see his eyes amber in the firelight, and they were bright, wet. The eyes of a man watching something he thought he would never see. Tenderness in his brother's voice. A woman's hand holding what was broken. Care given without condition or calculation. They spent 2 days in the cabin while the blizzard screamed outside. 2 days of firelight and fever. 2 days of Clara's steady hands and quiet voice, of Jasper's delirium and Elijah's vigil. 2 days in which the walls between all three of them came down quietly and irrevocably in the face of something that was stronger than pride, stronger than fear, stronger than 20 years of silence. When the storm broke on the third morning, the world outside was white and still and blinding. Caleb arrived with a horse-drawn sledge, his face gray with worry, and found his brothers alive. And his Clara, when had she become his? Clara, he could not identify the moment, only the certainty, exhausted but whole. "You saved him," Caleb said, looking at Clara. Clara shook her head. "I just kept the fire going." But they all knew it was more than fire. Jasper's recovery took 3 weeks. During those weeks, confined to a chair by the stove with his legs splinted and his pride in ruins, he was forced into a proximity with Clara that his defenses would never have permitted voluntarily. She changed his bandages. She helped him move from bed to chair and back. She read to him the same book she had once read to the blind boarder in Philadelphia, her voice rising and falling through stories of adventure and frontier justice that Jasper pretended not to enjoy. One afternoon, when Clara was certain he was asleep, Jasper spoke without opening his eyes. "Why did you come up the mountain?" Clara looked up from her mending. "I told you, the storm." "No, why did you come to Montana? To us?" "Why?" She set her needle down. "Because I had nowhere else to go." Jasper opened his eyes. "That is not enough." "It was all I had." And now she held his gaze. Amber eyes sharp and searching, touched with a fire his brothers did not possess. "Now I have more," she said simply. Jasper closed his eyes. His jaw worked. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that was not pain. "I am glad you came." 4 words. From Jasper Blackwood, they were everything. The fragile peace shattered on a Thursday night. Clara was on the stairs barefoot, carrying a glass of water for Jasper when she heard their voices. Elijah and Caleb in the kitchen, speaking in the low, intense tones that men use when they do not want to be heard. "We cannot keep doing this, Eli." Caleb's voice strained to its limits. "I know, to you. She is not a piece of equipment. She is not part of the ranch. She is a person." "I know that. Do you, because you thanked her for the accounts last week the same way you thanked the farrier for shoeing the horses." Silence. The sound of a man swallowing words he is not ready to speak. "What do you want me to do, Caleb?" Elijah's voice came then, and it was a voice Clara had never heard from him. Raw, ragged, stripped of every layer of control and command. The voice of a man standing at the edge of something he has spent his entire life avoiding. "She is here because of the arrangement, because you wrote those letters, because this ranch needs. What do you want me to say? That you care about her, that she matters, that she is not just useful." "I know what she is." A whisper now. "I know exactly what she is, and that is the problem. Because if I say it, then I lose the last wall I have. And without that wall, I do not know who I am." A long silence. The stove ticked. The wind pressed against the windows. "But you are the man she already sees," Caleb said quietly, "the man she already trusts. You just have to be brave enough to see yourself the same way." Clara stood on the stair to water glass, forgotten tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She had heard enough. More than enough. She returned to her room, closed the door, and sat in the dark. She knew now that all three brothers cared for her, each differently, each genuinely. She knew the arrangement, which had begun as a transaction, had become something tangled and alive and terrifying. And she knew with a certainty that settled in her chest like a stone sinking into deep water that she could not stay if staying meant driving a wedge between brothers. Margaret's diary whispered in her memory, "The mountain takes everything. If loving her cost the Blackwood brothers their bond, then the mountain would win again. The silence would consume another woman, and this time it would take 3 men down with her." Clara did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind, holding the note from Jasper in one hand and the letter from Caleb in the other. By morning, she had made her decision. She began quietly to pack her carpet bag. Clara wrote 3 letters by candlelight. The flame threw her shadow against the wall, large and wavering, as though the shadow belonged to someone bigger than the woman who cast it. The house was silent. The brothers were asleep or pretending to be, each in his own room, behind his own closed door, carrying his own version of the weight that pressed on all of them. She wrote slowly, carefully, each word chosen with the precision of someone who knows these may be the last words she ever offers. The first letter was for Elijah. You are the strongest man I have ever known, and your greatest strength is not in your arms or your will. It is in the care you show your brothers even when you call it duty. You build walls because you believe walls keep people safe, and you are right, they do, but they also keep people out. You told me I was more than useful. You were right about that too, but you deserve to be more than a wall, Elijah. You deserve to be a door, one that opens. The second letter was for Caleb. You wrote me letters that saved my life. I do not say this to be dramatic. I say it because it is true. When I was in Philadelphia, drowning in a life that had no place for me, your words were the hand that pulled me to the surface. You asked about my favorite book, and you wanted to know the answer. You asked about my happiest memory, and you remembered what I said. No one had ever done that for me. No one had ever treated my thoughts as something worth keeping. I will carry your letters with me wherever I go. Thank you for seeing me. The third letter was for Jasper. She wrote it last because it was the hardest. She wrote it with tears blurring her vision because the words came from a place so deep inside her that reaching them hurt. You called me by your mother's name. You do not remember doing it, but I remember. You were burning with fever in that cabin, and you held my hand, and you said, Mama, and I want you to know something, Jasper. She did not leave you because she wanted to. She fought to stay. I read her diary. I found it in the locked room, and I know I should not have opened it, but I did. And I need you to know what she wrote. She loved you. She loved all of you. She loved you with everything she had, and it was the mountain that took her, not her choice. You are not abandoned, Jasper. You were loved. You are loved. You are loved still. She folded the 3 letters and placed them on the kitchen table side by side like cards dealt in a game she was forfeiting. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She picked up her carpet bag, the same carpet bag she had carried off the train in Ridgewater 7 weeks ago. Heavier now, with things she had accumulated, lighter now, with things she was leaving behind. She opened the front door. Jasper was standing on the porch. He was leaning on a crutch he had made himself from a pine branch, his splinted leg held awkwardly to one side, his face tight with a pain he was ignoring through sheer force of will. He was wearing his coat over his nightclothes, and his breath made small clouds in the freezing air, and he looked like a man who had been standing there for a long time waiting for exactly this. Where are you going? His voice was quiet, not angry, not hostile, just tired. Tired and afraid and stripped of everything except the question. I have to go, Clara whispered. I'm making things worse. You and your brothers, you were a family before I came. You had each other. And now I am the thing that is pulling you apart. I can hear it. I heard you, Elijah and Caleb, arguing about me, about what I am, about what I mean. And I will not be the wedge that splits this family open, Jasper. I will not be the reason you lose each other. Jasper stared at her. The moonlight caught his face, the sharp jaw, the amber eyes, the scar across his knuckles. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who has run out of defenses and is standing in the rubble of his own walls, too tired to rebuild and too proud to admit they are down. You are the best thing that has happened to this family in 20 years. The words hung in the frozen air between them, visible in small clouds of breath, real and solid and impossible to take back. Jasper, you think I do not know what you have done? He shifted on the crutch, wincing. You cleaned this house. You fed us food that did not come from a can. You taught a motherless boy his letters. You rode into a blizzard for me, Clara, the man who would not eat at your table, the man who tried to make you hate this place so you would leave on your own, the man who called this arrangement a fool's errand to your face. His voice cracked the sound of something fundamental giving way. And now you are leaving because you think you are the problem. The three of you are idiots, all three of us, stubborn, scared, half-broken idiots who did not know how to want someone until you showed up and reminded us what it felt like. He took a breath. The air was so cold that it must have burned his lungs, but he did not flinch. Do not go, please. It was the first time Jasper Blackwood had said the word please in his adult life. Clara knew this the way she knew the color of his eyes. She knew it because please is a word that admits need, and Jasper had spent 20 years pretending he needed nothing. The front door opened behind them. Caleb stepped out, his hair disheveled, a coat thrown over his nightclothes, his face creased with sleep and worry. Behind him, Elijah appeared in the doorway fully dressed because Elijah slept in his clothes, always ready, always braced for disaster, a sentinel even in sleep. The three brothers stood on the porch before Clara in the blue light of a Montana winter dawn, and for the first time in their lives, they were not arguing. They were not divided. They were not pulling in three separate directions. They were unified, and the force that unified them was the terror of losing her. Elijah spoke first. His voice was steady, but Clara could see his hands, and his hands were not. We are not our father, he said. We are not going to let you disappear into this mountain. We are not going to let the silence eat you alive, the way it ate our mother. We will do better, Caleb said, and his voice was the voice from the letters, the voice that had reached across 2,000 miles and pulled her out of a life that was killing her slowly. We will talk. We will be honest. We will try. That is all we can promise, Clara, but we will try. Stay, Jasper said. One word. He did not say please again. He did not need to. The word was still there, hanging in the air, still visible in the cold. Clara looked at them. Three men, massive, scarred, terrified, standing on a porch in the freezing dark because a woman with a carpet bag was walking away and they could not bear it. She saw them for what they were. Not the mountain wild men of Ridgewater's whispers, not dangerous savages, not three giants to be feared or mocked or pitied, just boys. Three boys who had lost their mother and never recovered. Three men who had built walls because they did not know how to build bridges. Three hearts that had been shut so long they had nearly forgotten how to open, but were opening now here in the cold for her. And she saw herself, not the worthless burden Aunt Prudence had created, not the plain girl with no prospects and no grace, a woman who could clean a house and keep accounts and splint a broken leg and ride through a blizzard and hold a man's hand through the dark. A woman who was needed, a woman who mattered, a woman who had come 2,000 miles with one carpet bag and built something worth fighting for. She set the carpet bag down. If I stay, she said, things change. We talk about everything, about the letters, about the diary, about your mother and your father and what this arrangement is and what it could be. No more locked rooms, no more silence, no more walls. Three nods. Three pairs of amber eyes identical in color, utterly different in what they held. Elijah's burning with a vulnerability so raw it looked like pain. Caleb's bright with a hope so fierce it looked like prayer. Jasper's wet with something he would deny until his dying day. Deal, Elijah said. Clara picked up the carpet bag, walked back into the house, and began making coffee. The body of Emmett Cole was found 2 weeks later. A trapper passing through the high country discovered it in a ravine on the western edge of the Blackwood property. A man in his mid-40s, wiry, weathered, dressed in the layers of someone who lived on the trail. He had been shot once, at close range. The bullet had entered his chest just below the left collarbone and had killed him quickly, though perhaps not instantly. His saddlebags were empty. His horse was gone. His body had been dragged from the trail and rolled into the ravine, an attempt at concealment that the early snow had nearly completed. The news reached Ridgewater before it reached the mountain. And the town, which had spent 7 weeks whispering about the Blackwood bride, found something new to whisper about. Found on Blackwood land, shot dead and dumped in a ditch. Those three always knew they were trouble. Wild men, animals. What did anyone expect? Drake Holt, Justice of the Peace, convened a town meeting within the day. He stood at the front of the church, which served as meeting hall when the occasion demanded, and addressed the crowd with the grave, measured tone of a man performing sorrow. Drake was 55 years old, lean, silver-haired, dressed in a dark suit that fit him well enough to suggest a past more prosperous than his present. He had been a lawyer in St. Louis before coming west, and he retained a lawyer's polish, the smooth voice, the steady eye contact, the ability to arrange facts into narratives that served his purposes while appearing to serve justice. He was the most respected man in Ridgewater, church elder, charitable benefactor, the man who settled disputes, officiated weddings, and spoke at funerals with an eloquence that moved women to tears. Beneath the polish, Drake Holt was drowning. He owed money, a staggering sum accumulated over years of gambling in private rooms in San Francisco and Helena and Butte, fed by an addiction that his public persona had concealed with flawless discipline. The debts were held by a concern in San Francisco called the Thornton Group Men, who did not negotiate and did not forget and did not extend deadlines. Drake had received 3 letters in the past year. The last one had used the word consequences twice. Emmett Cole had known about the debts. Cole had trapped in these mountains for years, had passed through San Francisco, had connections in the gambling world, and had arrived in Ridgewater 10 days before his death with knowledge he intended to sell. Silence Cole had proposed. Silence in exchange for money Drake did not have. Drake had met Cole at the Lucky Strike. They had talked in a corner booth, 2 men leaning close, voices low. Then Drake had followed Cole out of town up the Western Trail toward the Blackwood boundary. He had pulled his revolver on a dark stretch of switchback. He had fired once. He had dragged the body into the ravine. He had ridden home, washed his hands, and gone to bed. And now he stood in the church and pointed the town's fury at the most convenient target available. A man has died on our land, Drake said. The evidence points toward those who live apart from us, who reject our community, who have chosen isolation, and I fear lawlessness. He let the pause land. He was good at pauses. I do not wish to condemn any man without proof. But I ask you, good people, who else might have done this? Who else lives on that mountain? Who else has the means, the motive, the temperament? So the crowd stirred. Mutters became murmurs. Murmurs became shouts. The anger that had always simmered beneath Ridgewater's fear of the Blackwoods rose to the surface like oil rising on water. Hang them. Ride up there and bring them down. 3 against 1. Of course they killed him. Drake raised his hand for quiet, performing reluctance, performing mercy, performing every virtue he did not possess. I propose we give the Blackwood brothers 24 hours to present themselves voluntarily. If they do not come down, we will go up. The motion carried. The crowd dispersed. And Drake Holt walked home to his office, poured himself a whiskey, and permitted himself a thin smile. The Blackwoods would be blamed. The Blackwoods would hang. And the secret of Drake Holt's debts would be buried deeper than Emmett Cole. Maggie Odell rode up the mountain the following morning with the news. Her horse was lathered. Her face was white. She came through the door of the ranch house without knocking because the situation was past knocking. They are coming, she said, still breathing hard from the climb. Drake Holt gave you one day. If you do not go down by tomorrow morning, they are forming a posse, 20 men armed. The kitchen went silent. Elijah stood by the stove, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. Caleb sat at the table, his half-carved figure motionless in his fingers. Jasper leaned against the wall, his splinted leg extended, his jaw set. Clara stood in the doorway. She had been hanging laundry on the porch when Maggie arrived. Her hands were chapped from the cold water and the wind, and she smelled of lye soap, and her hair was coming loose from its braid, and she was in that moment the calmest person in the room. None of you killed that man, she said. I know this. I have been here every night since I arrived. I know when you sleep. I know when you wake. I know where you go and when you return. But the town does not know this. They do not trust me. I am the Blackwood bride. My word means nothing to them. Then what do we do? Caleb asked, and his voice carried a desperation Clara had never heard from him. I find out who actually killed him. Elijah turned from the stove. You are not a detective, Clara. No, I am an observer. I have been observing my entire life. That is how you survive when nobody wants you. You watch, you notice, you catalog the things other people miss because they are too busy looking the other direction. She pulled her notebook from her apron pocket, the small ruled pages covered in her careful handwriting, dates, locations, details. Emmett Cole arrived in Ridgewater approximately 10 days before he died. He stayed at the Lucky Strike. Maggie, you told me last week that you saw him talking to someone at the saloon. Who was it? Maggie frowned, thinking. Drake Holt. They were at a corner table, private. Drake looked upset when he left. Clara wrote it down. Reverend Whitley, Cole went to the church. Maggie told me that too. The Reverend cannot reveal what Cole confessed, but he told Maggie that Cole was frightened, that Cole said he was carrying something someone would kill to keep quiet. She looked at the brothers, and Agnes Pruitt sees everything in that town. I need to know what she saw the night Cole died. You are going to ride in a Ridgewater and ask questions while a mob is forming to hang us, Jasper said. His voice was level, but his eyes were not. They are not going to hang anyone, Clara said. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, because I am going to find the truth, and the truth is going to be louder than Drake Holt's lies. She said it with such certainty that for a moment, just a moment, all three brothers believed her. Not because the plan was sound, it was barely a plan at all, but because Clara Whitfield, standing in a doorway with a notebook in her chapped hand and conviction in her green eyes, was more convincing than any plan could be. The next morning before dawn, Clara did something that would have shocked Aunt Prudence into silence and possibly into a heart condition. She broke into Drake Holt's office. She rode down the mountain alone in the dark, the rifle Jasper had given her strapped to the saddle, the cold so intense that her breath froze on her scarf and her fingers went numb inside her gloves. Ridgewater was quiet when she arrived. The pre-dawn dark lay over the town like a blanket, and the only light was the faint glow of a lamp in the Lucky Strike, where the bartender was already preparing for the day's custom. Drake's office was attached to the land office at the east end of the main street. The front door was locked, but the side window Clara had learned from Tommy Dawkins during one of their letter lessons was never latched. Tommy knew this because Tommy knew every unlatched window, an unlocked cellar, an unwatched back door in Ridgewater, because Tommy was 8 years old and curious and motherless, and had no one to tell him that climbing through windows was wrong. Clara climbed through the window. The office was small, neat, arranged with the precision of a man who believed order was a form of control. A desk, a bookshelf, a chair, a lamp she did not dare light. Clara worked by the faint pre-dawn gray leaking through the window, her hands moving quickly over the desk's contents, opening drawers, scanning documents, looking for the things she knew must be here because a man who gambles keeps records of his debts, the way a wounded animal keeps returning to the place where it was hurt. She found it in the bottom drawer beneath a stack of legal correspondence. A small leather notebook, its pages dense with figures, dates and amounts, payments made, payments missed, letters referenced by number. And on the last page in Drake's precise handwriting, a notation that stopped Clara's breath. E. Cole knows about SF debts, demands payment for silence, cannot allow this to continue. Cannot allow this to continue. Clara stared at the words, 4 words that were in effect a confession. Not admissible in court, perhaps. Not proof beyond doubt, but evidence. Real evidence written in the hand of the man who had stood in the church and pointed a town's fury at 3 innocent men. She also found the letters from San Francisco. 3 of them opened on the desk. The Thornton Group. The language was polite in the way a knife is polite, smooth and curved, and designed to find soft places. The debts were enormous. The deadlines were passed. The word consequences appeared in the final letter underlined twice. Clara took the notebook. She took the letters. She climbed back through the window. And then she rode to Agnes Pruitt's house before the town woke. Agnes answered the door in her nightcap, irritated and curious in equal measure, which was Agnes Pruitt's default state. Drake Holt, Clara said, standing on the porch, the leather notebook in her hand. The night Emmett Cole died. What did you see? Agnes stared at her. The irritation faded. Something else took its place, something that might have been respect, though Agnes would never have called it that. I see everything in this town, Agnes said. That is not vanity. That is fact. Then tell me what you saw. Agnes pulled her shawl tighter. She looked up and down the street as though checking for witnesses, and then she spoke in a voice lower than Clara had ever heard her use. Drake Holt left his house that night, late after 10. I know because I was up with my rheumatism and I saw him through my front window. He rode west, toward the mountain. His horse came back the next morning with red mud on its legs. Red mud, Mrs. Blackwood. The only red mud within 10 miles of this town is on the western trail near the ravine where they found that poor man's body. Clara wrote it down. Her hand was steady. Her heart was not. Will you say this publicly, Mrs. Pruitt? Agnes Pruitt was many things. She was sharp-tongued. She was nosy. She was the architect of more ruined reputations than any scandal in the territory's history. But she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And then she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was at her core the parent. And she would bust at her core the coward. And she would maul at her core the coward. And she would maul at her core the coward. And she would maul at her core the coward. And she would maul at her core the coward. And she would down at her core a coward. And she would bomb at her core a coward. And she would maul at her core a coward. And she would at her a coward. And she would at her core a coward. And she would at her bar a coward. And she would at her bar a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her paw a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her paw a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core a coward. And she was not at her core cruel. She was a woman who watched because watching was all she had. And she told what she saw because the truth was the only currency she possessed. If it comes to that, Agnes said slowly, yes, I will. Clara rode back up the mountain with the notebook and the letters, and Agnes Pruitt's testimony, and the first star of the morning fading above the peaks. She arrived at the ranch just as Elijah and Caleb were saddling their horses, preparing to ride into Ridgewater and face whatever was waiting. I have evidence, she said, dismounting breathless. Drake Holt killed Emmett Cole. He owed gambling debts to a syndicate in San Francisco. Cole knew about the debts and came to blackmail him. Drake killed Cole and dumped the body near our property to blame you. She laid the notebook, the letters, and her own notes on the kitchen table. 3 pieces of evidence, Three paths to the truth. There is one more thing, she said. We need a witness, someone who saw what happened that night. And I think we have one. She looked toward the window, toward the tree line, toward the ridge where for weeks a campfire had flickered in the darkness. Your father, she said quietly. He has been watching this ranch for weeks. The footprints, the carved flower, the fire on the ridge. It is him. And if he was on that ridge the night Cole died, he may have seen everything. Josiah Blackwood came out of the trees that afternoon. He emerged from the tree line the way a ghost materializes from fog, slowly, uncertainly, as though the act of becoming visible required a courage he was not sure he still possessed. He was 58 years old, though he looked older. His back was bent. His beard was long and gray, stained with tobacco. His clothes were the layered, patched remnants of 20 years lived in the wild. He carried a pack on his back and a rifle that was older than any of his sons. He walked into the yard of the ranch he had built with his own hands 30 years ago. And he stopped and he looked at the house, and for a moment the years seemed to collapse like a telescope. And he was young again, and Margaret was alive, and the boys were small, and the world was still whole. Then the door opened, and Elijah stepped onto the porch, and the collapse reversed, and the years returned, and Josiah Blackwood was old and broken, and standing before the son he had abandoned. Pa, Elijah said the word the way a man says the name of a disease he has just been diagnosed with. Flat, dead, final. Caleb appeared behind Elijah. Then Jasper on his crutch, his face a mask of fury, so controlled it appeared almost calm. Josiah did not ask for forgiveness. He did not apologize. He did not explain. There is no explanation that covers 20 years. There is no arrangement of words in any language that can bridge the distance between a man who walked into the forest and the children he left behind. Josiah understood this with the bleak clarity of a man who has had 20 years to think about what he has done and has spent every one of those years arriving at the same conclusion. There is no fixing it. There is only what remains. I saw who killed that man, he said. The yard went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. I was on the ridge above the western ravine. I have been staying up there, watching the ranch, watching you. His voice was rough, unused to speaking to anyone but himself in the trees. That night I saw two men on the trail. One was the trapper. The other was a man from town. He wore a dark vest, rode a dark horse. They talked. Then the man in the vest drew a pistol and fired. One shot. I heard it. I saw the trapper fall. The man dragged the body into the ravine and went through his things. Then he rode away. Josiah opened his hand. On his palm, small and silver and damning, lay a button, a vest button, engraved with two initials. This fell off his coat when he was dragging the body. I climbed down and found it after he left. Jasper spoke. His voice came from somewhere deep inside his chest, from a place where rage and grief had been compressed together for 20 years until they were indistinguishable from each other. You left us. The words were not about the button or the murder or the man in the vest. They were about everything. They were about a 6-year-old boy standing in a doorway watching his father walk into the trees. Eli was 14. Caleb was 9. I was 6. You walked into those trees and you never came back. You left us to raise ourselves, to feed ourselves, to bury our childhood in this dirt. And now you come back with a button and you think that makes it right. Nothing makes it right, Josiah said. His voice cracked on the word nothing. It was the first time Clara had seen him show emotion, and it was not the emotion she expected. It was not remorse. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who has looked at the full scope of his failure and has not flinched. I did not come back to be forgiven. I came because you need this. And because I owe your mother a debt I can never repay. She would have wanted me to come. She would have wanted you to have this ranch. She loved this place even when it was killing her. Do not say her name, Jasper whispered. Clara stepped forward. She did not move between Jasper and Josiah. That was not her place. But she stood beside Jasper close enough that he could feel her presence, and she put her hand on his arm. "Let him speak," she said softly. "Then you can decide." Jasper looked down at her. His eyes were red. His jaw was trembling. He looked like the boy he had been 6 years old, standing in a doorway watching the world walk away from him. He nodded. Once, Josiah told his story. It was not a story of cruelty. It was a story of devastation. When Margaret died, Josiah's grief had been so complete that it erased him. He could not look at his sons without seeing her face. He could not stay in the house where she had lived and laughed and died. He ran into the mountains, into the silence, into the snow, and he kept running for 20 years. "I am not a good man," he said. "I am not a brave man. I am a man who lost the woman he loved and could not survive it. And I punished my sons for the crime of reminding me of her." Clara asked the question that needed asking. Can you survive without his testimony? The brothers looked at each other. The answer was on their faces before anyone spoke. "No." "Then take it," Clara said, "and decide what to do with your father later. He is old. Sin, the winter will kill him if you send him out now. Let him stay through the storm season. After that, you decide." It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was a ceasefire. And a ceasefire, Clara had learned, was sometimes enough. The confrontation happened the following morning in the Ridgewater town square. Clara did not wait for the mob to come to them. She rode down the mountain with all four men, Elijah and Caleb and Jasper on horseback, Josiah in the wagon beside Clara, and they arrived in Ridgewater before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. The town was already awake. Men gathered in clusters. Rifles leaned against hitching posts. The air had the charged, dangerous quality of a thunderstorm building. Drake Holt stood in front of the church, flanked by a dozen armed men, his expression grave and sorrowful and entirely fabricated. "The Blackwood brothers have come," Drake announced, and his voice carried the practiced resonance of a man who had spent his career convincing people of things that were not true. "I commend their courage. Now let justice." Clara climbed down from the wagon. She walked forward past the brothers, past the armed men, until she stood directly in front of Drake Holt, a woman 5 feet 3 inches tall, staring up at the most powerful man in Ridgewater, with a leather notebook in her hand and the weight of the truth on her shoulders. "Mr. Holt," she said, "you killed Emmett Cole." The square went silent, not the comfortable silence of a pause in conversation, but the absolute silence that precedes an explosion. Every face turned toward her. Every eye widened. "Emmett Cole came to Ridgewater because he knew about your gambling debts with the Thornton Group in San Francisco." Clara held up the notebook. "You wrote it yourself. Every dollar, every letter, every missed payment. And on the last page in your own hand, you wrote his name and the words, 'Cannot allow this to continue.'" She held up the letters. 3 letters from San Francisco confirming the debts and threatening consequences. She held up the button, a silver button engraved with your initials. "DH, found at the scene by a witness who saw you shoot Emmett Cole on the Western Trail and drag his body into the ravine." Drake's face changed. The mask of gravity and sorrow dissolved like sugar in hot water, and what appeared beneath it was something cold, something cornered, something that had been hiding behind the polish and the eloquence for years. "You are a mail-order bride," he said, and his voice had lost its smoothness. It was thin now, reedy, the voice of a man hearing the sound of his own destruction. "You are nobody. You have no standing in this town." Clara looked at him. She was trembling. Her hands, her voice, her heart. Everything trembled, but she did not look away. "I am Clara Whitfield," she said, "Boanchen. I came to Montana with 1 carpet bag and no illusions. I have cleaned a house, survived a blizzard, splinted a broken leg, and faced a mountain lion. I may be nobody to you, Mr. Holt, but I am somebody to them." She did not gesture toward the brothers. She did not need to. Everyone in the square knew who she meant. Josiah stepped forward. He was shaking his old hands unsteady, but his voice when it came was clear. 20 years of silence had stored the words, and now they poured out with the force of a dam breaking. I was on the ridge above the ravine. I saw you ride up the western trail. I saw you meet the trapper. I heard the shot. I saw you drag the body and go through his belongings. I found this button where you dropped it. Agnes Pruitt's voice came from the porch of the general store, unexpected and devastating. I saw Drake leave his house that night. After 10, his horse had red mud on his legs the next morning. Red mud only comes from the western trail near the ravine. I see everything in this town. I have been seeing everything for 30 years, and I know what I saw. The crowd shifted. The murmurs changed direction the way a river changes direction when the ground beneath it moves. Faces that had been set in righteous anger softened into doubt. Doubt became calculation. Calculation became realization. Reverend Whitley stood from his seat at the back of the crowd. His voice was not strong, but it was steady. If what these people say is true, this is a matter for the territorial judge in Helena. I move to detain Mr. Holt pending investigation. I further move that all charges against the Blackwood family be suspended immediately. The motion carried. Drake Holt was led away in handcuffs through the town he had controlled for a decade past the faces of people he had deceived. His expression as he passed Clara was pure malice concentrated and burning. But it was the malice of a man who has already lost, and Clara, who had faced Aunt Prudence's malice every day for 15 years, was not impressed. Elijah stood beside her. For the first time in front of the town, he placed his hand on her shoulder. The gesture was gentle and deliberate, and it said everything his voice could not. "You heard her," he said to the crowd, his voice deep and even. "She is my family, our family. Next time anyone has something to say about that, remember what happened here today." Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. For the first time, the silence of Ridgewater was not contempt. It was respect. The Ridgewater Winter Festival was held on the first Saturday of March, when the worst of the cold had passed and the valley turned its face towards spring. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between the buildings. A fiddle player tuned his instrument on a platform built from barn boards. Tables groaned with food brought by every family in the valley, pies and roasted meats and bread still warm from ovens. Children chased each other through the crowd, their laughter rising into the cold, clear air like sparks from a fire. Clara wore a new dress, red, deep, rich red, the color of courage, the color of declaration. Maggie had helped her make it, sewing by lamplight. Over 3 evenings, the two women talking and laughing and drinking Maggie's excellent coffee, while the fabric took shape under their hands. The dress was fitted at the waist, modest at the neckline, with delicate embroidery at the cuffs that Maggie had insisted upon. Clara's honey blonde hair was swept up and secured with a simple comb. She wore her mother's cameo brooch at her throat, the only thing she had brought from Philadelphia that mattered. She looked for the first time in her life the way she felt. Beautiful. Not because the dress was fine or her hair was perfect or her body had changed. Her body had not changed. She was the same Clara who had stepped off the stagecoach 7 weeks ago, the same petite, full-figured girl that Aunt Prudence had mocked and Ridgewater had laughed at. But she carried herself differently now. She stood differently. She held her head at a different angle, and her eyes met the world with a directness that had not been there before. Something had shifted inside her, some essential architecture of the self, and the shift was visible to everyone who looked. The brothers had cleaned up for the occasion with a seriousness that bordered on comedy. Elijah wore a dark shirt, pressed his hair, combed back, his jaw freshly shaved. Caleb wore a blue vest over a white shirt, and without his usual stubble, he looked almost boyish, the gentleness of his face fully visible for once. Jasper, off his crutch now, but still limping, wore a black coat that strained across his massive shoulders. His auburn hair actually washed and combed a transformation so dramatic that Clara had to press her lips together to keep from laughing. When the Blackwood party arrived at the festival, the crowd parted. But the parting was different now. Not the fearful, contemptuous parting that had greeted Clara's arrival in Ridgewater. This was something else. Curiosity, cautious warmth, The strange, grudging respect that frontier people reserve for those who have survived something hard and come out standing. That is her, the one who stood up to Drake Holt, broke into his office and found the evidence herself. She rode down that mountain in the dark, alone. That girl has steel in her. Clara heard the whispers. She did not drop her eyes. The fiddle player struck his first note. The music rose into the cold night air, tentative at first, then finding its rhythm, finding its voice. Couples began to move onto the open ground that served as a dance floor, laughing, stumbling, stepping on each other's feet, with the joyful clumsiness of people who work too hard and dance too rarely. Caleb was the first to ask. He stepped in front of Clara and extended his hand, the hand that had carved wooden animals and written letters that had saved her life. "May I?" Clara took his hand. They moved onto the floor and began to dance, slowly, gently, the way Caleb did everything. He held her as though she were the most precious thing on the mountain, his touch light, his smile warm, his amber eyes never leaving her face. "I wrote those letters because I was lonely," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "But I would write 1,000 more just for this." They turned together in the lantern light, and the crowd watched, and some of them smiled, and some of them looked away, embarrassed by a tenderness they were unaccustomed to witnessing. But nobody laughed. The time for laughing at Clara Whitfield was over. When the song ended, Jasper stepped forward. He did not ask. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply extended his scarred hand and waited. Clara took it. Their dance was different from Caleb's. Stronger, more intense. The tension between them was electric, a current running through their joined hands, through the space between their bodies. Jasper held her firmly, his good leg compensating for the bad one, his massive frame making her feel not small, but sheltered. "I have never danced before," he said. His jaw was tight. "Neither have I," Claire replied. "Not really. You are good at it." "So are you." He looked down at her, and for once, just once, the hardness in his amber eyes dissolved completely. What remained was something raw and young and frightened the boy inside the man, the 6-year-old who had never stopped waiting for someone to come back. "I am sorry," he said, "for everything, for how I was. You were afraid. I was a fool." Those are not mutually exclusive. And there it was, the smallest crack of a smile on Jasper Blackwood's face. The first genuine smile Clara had ever seen from him. It changed his face the way sunrise changes a mountain, not by altering the stone, but by revealing what the darkness had hidden. He was, Clara realized with a start that went through her like a physical sensation. Handsome. Not just large, not just powerful, but handsome in a way that his perpetual scowl had concealed. The smile made his eyes warm. It softened his jaw. It turned the scar on his knuckles from a mark of violence into a mark of survival. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "The wildflowers, the rifle, the plates, everything you did when you thought I was not watching." His ears turned red. Jasper Blackwood, 6 feet 7 inches of mountain and muscle, and barely contained fury, blushed. The second song ended. Elijah approached. He stood before Clara, ramrod straight, jaw clenched, and said nothing for a long moment. The fiddle player held his bow. The crowd held its breath. Even the lanterns seemed to hold their light. "I am not good at this," Elijah said. "At dancing, at everything, at letting someone in, at saying what I feel, at being anything other than a wall." He paused, and the pause cost him something visible, something that tightened his face and brightened his eyes. "But you said in that letter that I deserve to be more than a wall. You said I deserve to be a door that opens, and you were right." He extended his hand. His fingers were stiff. His face was tight with the effort of vulnerability, the effort of letting someone see the machinery behind the stone. Clara took his hand. They danced. And Elijah Blackwood, who had not held another person with tenderness since his mother's funeral, who had spent 22 years turning himself into granite, held Clara Whitfield as though she were the last warm thing in a world made of ice. "You are more than useful, Clara," he said, his voice barely audible above the fiddle. "You are everything. You are everything I did not know I was missing." Her eyes filled, but she was smiling, buoyant and bright and unashamed and free. "You are not a wall, Elijah. You never were. You are a foundation, the thing everything else is built on." The music swelled. They turned together. And the crowd, the same crowd that had mocked Clara's arrival, that had whispered about the Blackwood arrangement, that had called her names and predicted her failure, watched in silence. Then slowly applause began. Not from everyone, not from the truly small-hearted who would always find a reason to sneer, but from enough, Reverend Wistely clapping softly in the corner, Agnes Pruitt with her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes suspiciously bright, Maggie Odell cheering without restraint, Tommy Dawkins clapping wildly from his father's two shoulders, his gap-toothed grin visible across the square. Clara danced with each of the three Blackwood brothers in front of everyone without shame, without apology, without hiding. The woman who had arrived in Ridgewater afraid to meet a stranger's eyes now met the gaze of an entire town and did not flinch. Jasper leaned close and whispered, "Let them see." Caleb took her hand. Elijah placed his hand on her shoulder so gently that the crowd watching went quiet. The gesture from a man that size, that hard, that closed was more eloquent than any speech. The fiddle played on, the night deepened, the lanterns burned gold against the dark. And Clara Whitfield danced until the stars wheeled overhead and the mountains stood witness to something they had not seen in a very long time. A family whole and unbroken learning what it meant to love. April came to Blackwood Ridge the way redemption comes to a life that has earned it, slowly, gently, with flowers. The snow retreated up the peaks like a tide pulling back from a shore, revealing the meadow beneath brown at first and then green, an impossible luminous green that made Clara's eyes ache after months of white and gray. Wildflowers erupted from the ground as though the earth itself was celebrating. Mountain asters purple and gold, columbine in shades of blue that matched the sky. Indian paintbrush, red as flames, scattered across the meadow, like sparks from a fire that burned without consuming. Clara sat on the porch of the Blackwood Ranch on a morning in the middle of the month. The house behind her had been transformed, repaired, expanded. A new section added to the south side, more room, more light, more space for a family that was growing in ways that could not be measured in square footage. Smoke rose from the chimney. Chickens pecked in the yard, unbothered by the world. The vegetable garden Clara had planned in December, implanted in March, showed the first green shoots of the season, pushing through the dark soil with a determination that reminded her of herself. Inside the house, she could hear the brothers' voices, Elijah giving instructions for the day's work. His voice deepened, steady, and carrying through the walls the way the sound of a river carries through stone. Caleb humming a song she did not recognize, something slow and gentle. Jasper complaining about the coffee because Jasper always complained about the coffee. It was his way. It was Clara had come to understand his language of love. Jasper did not say, "I am happy." He said the coffee is too weak. And everyone who knew him understood the translation. Tommy Dawkins sat beside Clara on the porch practicing his letters on a slate. His handwriting was improving. His confidence was improving more. His father, freed from the shadow of Drake Holt's influence, had found work at a neighboring ranch and had entrusted Tommy to Clara's care during the working days. The boy was thriving. He was brown from the sun and growing like the wildflowers, upward and outward, reaching for light. Josiah Blackwood had stayed through the winter. He slept in a small room they had built for him off the barn, separate from the main house, close enough to be present, but distant enough to respect the space his sons needed. He ate at the table now at Caleb's insistence over Jasper's objection, though Jasper's objections had grown quieter as the weeks passed, shifting from fury to irritation to a grudging tolerance that was by Jasper's standards practically an embrace. The relationship between father and sons was not healed. 20 years of abandonment could not be erased by a single winter. But it was beginning, and Clara had learned that beginning was sometimes enough. She opened her Bible to press a new wildflower between the pages. A purple aster picked that morning, its petals still damp with dew. As she opened the book, the dried flowers from months ago fluttered out. The ones Jasper had tucked beneath clean plates. The ones someone had placed in a jar in her room on the very first night when she was a stranger and frightened and alone. She had never found out who left them. She looked up from the Bible and saw Caleb crossing the yard, a mason jar in his hand filled with fresh wildflowers, asters and columbine and a single stem of paintbrush, arranged with the careful eye of a man who noticed beauty in everything. "For your room," he said, setting the jar on the porch railing, with a smile that had not changed since the first time she saw it, that first day on the wagon when he had said her name, and the world had shifted on its axis. Clara smiled back. So it had been Caleb, that first night, the flowers in the jar, the first kindness in a house full of silence. Of course it was Caleb. But then Jasper came around the corner of the barn, and in his fist, held with the same rough grace with which he did, everything was a handful of wild flowers. He walked to the porch, pulled the flowers from his grip, and dropped them into the jar beside Caleb's arrangement, without ceremony, without explanation, without a single word. Then he walked away. His ears were red again. And then Elijah, coming from the far side of the house where he had been checking the fence line. He stopped when he saw the jar on the railing overflowing now with two contributions. He looked at the flowers, he looked at Clara. He reached into the pocket of his coat. He produced a single flower, pressed flat, faded with age. A mountain aster, dried and delicate, that he had been carrying since the day Clara arrived. 7 months. He had kept it in his pocket for 7 months, this man who did not save sentimental things, who did not admit to feeling, who called himself a wall. He had kept a flower. He placed it in the jar with the rest. Then he stood on the porch, arms crossed, the faintest smile on his face, a smile so rare and so hard-won that it made the mountains look small. 3 brothers, 3 offerings, 1 jar overflowing with color and life and the stubborn beauty of a family that had refused to die. Clara laughed. The sound came out of her before she could catch it, free and unguarded and full of a joy so pure it startled everyone within earshot. Tommy looked up from his slate and grinned. Caleb smiled wider. Jasper pretended he had not heard, but his ears turned a shade of red that was visible from across the yard. And Elijah stood on the porch with his arms folded and his jaw set and his amber eyes bright, and he looked at Clara with an expression that said everything his mouth never would. Clara spoke, not to anyone in particular, to all of them, to the mountains, to the ghost of a woman named Margaret who had loved this place even as it consumed her, to the memory of a girl in a nightgown watching a building burn, to herself. "I came here with nothing," she said, "and look what I found." The mountain stood. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. The wildflowers turned their faces toward the sun, the way all living things turn toward warmth when the winter has been long enough. Anne Claire Whitfield, mail-order bride from Philadelphia, orphan, city girl, mountain woman, mother, to a boy who was not her blood partner, to 3 men who had forgotten how to love until she reminded them, sat on the porch of a house on a mountain in Montana and watched the spring arrive, and knew with a certainty that filled her the way sunlight fills a valley that she was finally, irrevocably, completely home. Not chosen out of pity, not tolerated out of duty, not endured out of obligation, but wanted, needed, seen. The jar of wildflowers sat on the railing, over full petals spilling over the edges, 3 kinds of flowers tangled together in the same water drawing life from the same source, turning toward the same light. A family whole and unbroken at the top of a mountain at the beginning of spring, learning what it meant to belong.